Good morning, everybody. That was a very nice intro to today. So, as Chairman of Teagasc, I just want to say a very warm welcome to you all, in particular to our Minister for Agriculture, Minister McConalogue, to our many number of people that have registered for today. They include senior members from the Department of Agriculture and Food, other department agencies, our farming organisations, farmers, our many Teagasc colleagues, and of course the number of people that are joining virtually online today. I think it is the fact that I've met a number of people from overseas. It's important to extend a very warm Irish welcome to our guests from both New Zealand and Australia that have joined us today. Today is all about the launch of the Teagasc MACC 2023. But, you know, before we maybe go into that in detail, just for one split second, I believe it would be remiss of me if I just didn't for a moment speak about the events of earlier this week. If we were travelling in the car yesterday, we had a choice of maybe three things. We could have listened to music, but if we wanted something of a more serious nature, we could have listened to the Public Accounts Committee, which was beyond my pay station, and I think many of you will say beyond yours as well, or also the Frank McNulty Primetime Investigates. Don't want to comment on that, but I just want to draw your attention to the press release that Teagasc issued yesterday. It covers 3 significant programmes that Teagasc have been involved with, covering the whole area of dairy breeding and animal welfare. And I think what's important to state is that those programmes have not been initiated either today or yesterday. They've been in existence with many years and will continue to do so. And I think, wearing my dual hat both as a farmer and as Chairman of Teagasc, I would like to acknowledge the very significant support and focus of our Director, Professor Frank O'Mara, and his team in the whole area of dairy breeding and animal welfare. And finally, but by no means least, I want to say well done to Eric Donald and his communications team for the timely manner in which they issued that press release. Press releases are of no use unless you read them. And what I would say to all of you today, please take time to read their press release. It really puts a strong focus on the work that Teagasc has been doing and is doing and will be doing for the future in the area of dairy breeding and animal welfare. And it is long may it continue, and it will continue. That was earlier in the week. Today is Wednesday. Today is our focus, and our focus is on launching the Teagasc MACC 2023, obviously dealing with the pathway to the future and dealing with the climate change targets. I think what is important to remember is that today is obviously a very important day where our chief scientific researchers will outline the programme and the future pathway. But equally, it is important to acknowledge that we have a Teagasc MACC as we speak, and indeed many of those pathways and indeed initiatives are already being undertaken by our farming sector and by the industry. And I think it is important to acknowledge the work that is being undertaken, and obviously today is a very significant add-on for the future. Maybe to put a structure on today's meeting, it is now 10 o'clock. We plan to finish at about 12:30. So for a start, our Director, Professor Frank O'Mara, will give his opening address. That will be followed by a ministerial address from our Minister McConalogue. And again, after that, we will move into the actual meat of the meeting, where our chief researcher will one of our chief researchers will outline, in particular, the Teagasc MACC 2023, what it's all about. And obviously that will be followed by a presentation in relation to the new scientific work that has been released in very recent weeks, which deals with the drainage status of our grassland peat soils. That will be followed by a question and answer session. And I think at that point it is important that today's meeting is not all about listening. I would certainly like today's meeting to be very much interactive, and where there will be inadequate questions and answer sessions. That will be followed by, again, research is absolutely great, But what is so important is to make sure that in Teagasc we have 3 pillars: research, education and advisory. And from an education and advisory programme, the Signpost advisory programme is something that is of vital importance to make sure that that research will funnel down its way to the key implementers at farm level. So a panel discussion will be followed at that point to make sure how best, what is the most effective way to make sure that, that the actions from the work from research and the actions from the Signpost Advisory Programme will best be implemented at farm level. So just maybe a few very brief housekeeping notes. Our exits are to the left and to the right. I would suggest don't follow me, but just, I think this is a Teagasc building, so health and safety is of prime importance here, so we've adequate exit signs there. And one thing I would certainly suggest to everybody, please, I ask that you all put your phones on silent, please. And I think for the benefit of today, it is important to note that today's event is being recorded and live streamed. So with that, Director, Professor Frank O'Mara, I invite you to the podium, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and good morning, Minister, members of the Teagasc Authority, colleagues and ladies and gentlemen. So look, this is a very, very important day, and I suppose for us it's maybe the second important day that we've had here in the last relatively short time. On the 1st of December last, we launched our climate action strategy, and that's to support farmers to take climate action. And there's been lots of significant developments and work going on in the meantime, but today is certainly one of those with the launch of our new MACC 2023, as we have christened it. So just to take you back to our climate strategy for a moment, it has 3 main pillars. And we said at the time, on the 1st of December, that we'd launch a new Signpost advisory programme, that in partnership with ICBF and Bord Bia, we develop a sustainability digital platform, and that we'd pull our research together to form a virtual national centre for agri-food, climate research and innovation. And I suppose we've made progress on all 3 fronts, which I just briefly want to outline. If we take the middle one first, the Sustainability Digital Platform, and that's a project that we're working on very hard with 2 partners, ICBF and Bord Bia. And without the 3 of us, without any one of those 3, we could not have delivered this element of the strategy. And we have progressed well on that. We now have a programme up and running. We've called it AgNav. And it's a programme that basically allows us to benchmark emissions and eventually sequestration at an individual farm level, and will allow a farmer to develop a customised plan for his or her farm. So it's certainly a long-term development for us, but we've got to the stage now that we have a version that's good enough to start working with farmers in our programmes. So great progress has been made on that, and I certainly would like to acknowledge the huge contribution that ICBF and Bord Bia have made, along with my own colleagues, in the development of that. Secondly, our Signpost Advisory Programme. We have launched that. We now have the first core of 21 specialised advisors dedicated to this programme in place, ready to begin the delivery of the Signpost Advisory Programme out to farmers. And we have very ambitious plans to work with up to 50,000 farmers in this programme over the next 7 years. Working with farmers at an individual level in this programme, using the AgNav as a central part of that, that's very much building on the already established Signpost programme, with over 120 demonstration farms established right around the country and covering all enterprises. And that programme has over 60 partners from industry. So that's a very, very important programme, as the Chairman has said, to bring the technologies we'll be talking about today down to an individual farm level. And our Head of Advisory, Tom Curran, will give an outline of where that programme has got to and what it's about later on in the morning. The third element of our strategy then was to establish this National Centre for Agri-Food Climate Research and Innovation. And we have now called that the Teagasc Climate Centre, and we hope to have the head of centre in place within the next few months. This centre, as I said, its purpose is to pull together all the research that we're doing in this area and to expand and accelerate that research. And again, we've made very good progress in putting in place the first phase of new staff into that centre so that we can expand and accelerate that research. And what we're going to present today is very much an output from that research programme and from the Teagasc Climate Centre. So the launch of MACC 2023, it is a major output for us. It's probably the first major manifestation of the Teagasc Centre. And I suppose you might ask, well, it's our third MACC. Why do we need another new one? Why is this important? Well, it's probably almost exactly a year, actually, since the sectoral target for agriculture was set. A lot of water has gone under the bridge since then, but this time last year we were debating 25% or 28% or 22% or whatever, and eventually the government agreed its sectoral targets, and the target was set at 25%. So what the MACC 2023 is the most comprehensive and detailed analysis yet of the technologies that are available to deliver that target. I suppose the question we all have, is can that target be delivered? What level of technology adoption is going to be needed to deliver it? What is the pathway indeed towards reaching our climate targets? So these are the questions that MACC 2023 will answer. And my colleague Gary Lanigan, who's the lead researcher on the team that developed MACC 2023, will outline it later this morning. And Gary and his colleagues, but in particular Gary, has put a huge amount of work into this, not just today or yesterday. This has been a long-term project in terms of developing this MACC. So that's a very important, I suppose, output, as I said, from our Teagasc Climate Centre. But we're also going to take the opportunity today to brief you on another very important piece of research that has come out of our research programme, and that's the new evidence that we've recently published about the area of our grassland peat soils which are drained. And the lead author of that study, Pat Toohey, will outline the details of that. So that's, I suppose, the core of what we're wanting to present today. We all know that the challenge of meeting our climate targets is huge. And today, I suppose, it is a very significant milestone along the pathway to reaching those targets. It's a big day, obviously, for Teagasc. We're putting ourselves, up here and nailing our colours to the mast. But it's also a big day for the agri-food industry in terms of setting out the pathway to achieving our climate targets. And I think it's very important for the industry that there is that pathway there, and that we can say to other sectors of the economy and to other countries indeed that, look, this is our plan, this is how we're going to achieve those targets. And the MACC is very much one of the building blocks of developing that pathway and that target to our climate targets. I'd like to acknowledge the funding that has been received from many sources on which the research today that we're presenting is built on. And that funding comes mainly through the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, through the grant and aid that the Minister and the Department provide to us, but also from the competitive research funding that the Department operate. It also is built on funding from Science Foundation Ireland, mainly through the Vista Milk Centre that SFI funds in partnership with the Department of Agriculture. Also funding from the EPA, and delighted to welcome Director of EPA Laura Burke here this morning. And another funding, very important funding source for us in this work is the EU through the Horizon research programmes. I'd also like to thank our research collaborators who we work very closely with in all the research that underpins the MACC. And they include partners from across the Irish universities, and delighted to welcome a number of people from UCD here this morning, and I'm sure other institutions as well that I just haven't seen this morning, but also international research institutions as well. They're all really important partners for us in doing the research that underpins the MACC. Lastly, I'd like to thank my colleagues, our researchers, for their hard work and dedication, which has led to the MACC 2023 and indeed other outputs. our advisors and teachers for their work supporting farmers and educating the next generation of farmers around all the new things that they need to know in terms of how we need to operate in order to reach these climate targets. And also our operations team in Teagasc, who do a fantastic job of keeping the wheels turning and allow all this research and advice and education to go on. And I, as Director, and I know my senior management colleagues are very grateful for the efforts of all our staff that allow us to have days like this. So I'll leave it at that, and hope that you find the day informative and that you take away some positives from it today, and that we'll have an interactive session with you, and that you'll challenge us because we all need to be challenged. And I'll be back later on in the morning to participate in the panel discussion at the end, and I'm looking forward to that. So, Gora Míle Maith Agam.
Thanks, Director. I now invite our Minister for Agriculture, Minister McConalogue, to give his ministerial address. But before I do, I think it would be remiss of me if I didn't acknowledge the Minister's very significant support and encouragement to Teagasc for virtue, number one, and his department, as the Director just mentioned, the financial support, but I think his own personal support as well. Last week we had a very important biannual open day at Moore Park, which is a hugely important. I'm not so sure we speak jokingly, not so sure how many people attended. I would have said if it was an IFA protest, we would say it was possibly upwards on 30,000. But I think what was important on that day was that the Minister was there. It was a day for farmers where they had lots of questions to ask. He delivered his address and certainly participated and answered many of the questions that farmers and stakeholders had to put to him. So I just want to say we really appreciate your support of Teagasc and support for the sector. And I would like to say that, unfortunately, because of work commitments, the Minister will have to leave after his address. So with that, let's put our hands together for a very special welcome, Minister.
Thank you very much, Liam, and welcome to everybody here this morning to the launch of Teagasc MACC curve for 2023 Pathways to Achieving Our Climate Action Targets. And I want to recognise the role that everyone who's had in terms of putting this really important plan together. And I want to thank yourself, Liam, as Chairman, and Frank as CEO, and all at Teagasc for the expertise and dedication and professionalism that you bring to actually this really important piece of work. And the importance of the launch here this morning is very much recognised by the attendance from people right across the sector. All of our key leaders in all sectors of agri-food have taken the time out to be here this morning for this, because I think everyone's very much aware of the importance of this process and of making sure that we step it out and make sure that it's a plan which we actually deliver on. It also demonstrates that the agriculture and land use sector has the ability to achieve its climate action plan targets, which we have set out at national level. The agri-food sector is our most important indigenous industry, which we're all aware, and it plays a vital role in our national economy and the fabric of our rural communities and of our society. The sustainability of Ireland's food production system is well recognised internationally and acts as a key competitiveness driver in international markets for Irish food producers. Our pastoral and arable systems resonate with customers and demonstrate our efficient systems of food and feed production in terms of climate footprint. The agriculture and land use sector can contribute in a very significant way to the overall ambition of achieving a 51% reduction in economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions between now and 2030. It will be challenging for the sector as a biological system, and with technologies still evolving to reach that 25% emissions reduction target that has been set for it. As long as the sector produces food, feed and fibre, we will have residual emissions. That's something we all accept. And this is different to other sectors of the economy where technological solutions and innovations are already available. The climate challenge is one of the biggest challenges that faces society. And I think it's particularly significant that we're here this morning launching this plan on the back of what was 2 or 3 of the warmest days the world ever experienced in the past week alone. I recognise that this important role Teagasc plays in supporting farmers and the agri-food sector in reaching their emissions reduction target. And this and previous Teagasc marginal abatement cost curves can provide farmers, industry and policymakers with a range of measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while also providing significant co-benefits for the environment. I'm keen to hear the latest scientific research that has been harnessed to update the MACC curve in order to inform policy in achieving our CAP 2030 targets. The new MACC outlines agreed scientific solutions and innovations that can and will help farmers achieve our targets to 2030. However, achieving emissions reduction targets will require early action, high rates of adoption of MACC actions and a multi-stakeholder approach. In terms of mitigation, or emissions mitigations actions, which will include the developments of pasture-based methane-reduced feed additives and the restoration of cultivated peaty soils. And over the next decade, we must act to cut chemical nitrogen use by making better use of organic manures and transitioning to clover and multi-species swards. The beef sector will need to transition to a system that reduces the average finishing age from the current 26.57 months to an average 24 months, and that will reduce absolute methane emissions on farm. From a carbon sequestration perspective, our efforts must focus on soil and forestry. The Climate Action Plan commits us to reducing the management intensity of up to 80,000 hectares of organic soil, better management of mineral grasslands, increasing cover crops and straw incorporation as carbon storing measures, and increasing our afforestation rates to enhance our carbon sinks. Finally, sustainable energy has a role to play through supply of biomass and agriculture feedstock and deployment of renewables. The sector provides a positive and important contribution towards the decarbonisation of the energy system through applying the energy efficiency principle first and reducing energy use at farm level, deploying renewable energy technology at farm level for self-consumption, but also a contribution to renewable energy generation through export of electricity to the grid. The Teagasc MACC is an enabler to inform policy decisions both now and in the future, but also to help stakeholders make informed decisions about how to allocate resources for emissions reductions. It provides insights into the cost effectiveness of different abatement options and helps identify the least costly ways to achieve a given emissions reductions target. Significant progress has been made from an efficiency perspective at farm level since the publication of the previous MACC in 2018, but this needs to accelerate further as absolute emissions have been increasing. From a knowledge transfer perspective, in order to implement and build awareness, both public and private advisory services are key to promoting change. By way of example, and as Frank referenced, the Teagasc Signpost Farm programme, supported by government and industry, will trial the adoption of new and existing technologies, innovations and production systems to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while maintaining, really importantly, farm profitability in the process. Irish farmers are incredibly committed to ensuring that they farm in a sustainable way. They are innovative, resilient and already committed to working together to find solutions in the face of this enormous challenge. They have embraced new technologies in areas like animal breeding, soil management and the environment, and invested in a variety of innovations and in machinery and equipment. The ambition is now being stepped up to ensure that there is a bright and sustainable future for farm families for this and for coming generations. And I want to thank Teagasc for your continued work in researching, guiding and setting a pathway to help meet our climate targets and inform agri-food policy into the future. And I want to thank all of you right across the agri-food sector for the commitment you've shown to delivering this future for Irish agriculture, a commitment that is very much reflected by the turnout by so many industry leaders here this morning for what is the launch of this very important updated plan. So, go raibh míle maith agah go léir, and let's continue with the work. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Minister. Really appreciate that. I think we're on time. That's the good news. And for the next 2 hours, we certainly will have, looking forward to having a very positive and interactive session. What I didn't mention at the outset is that, provided everybody is well behaved, we plan to break, maybe to finish, shortly after 12:30 and have lunch at that point. So with that, I'm having the easy option. I'm going to hand over to our facilitator for the rest of the day, and that is Suzanne Campbell. So I think, to put it in short, most of us know who Suzanne is. It's important from our point of view that we have somebody external and independent to facilitate today. And what better person than Suzanne, who is what I would describe as our best-known food and agribusiness journalist. So with that, over to you, Suzanne, please.
Hello and welcome. I'd echo Liam and Frank there in thanking so many people for travelling here today, and the Minister for making the effort to come and speak to us. We have a big audience online as well, and it's brilliant to see the interest in this launch today of MACC 23. If you don't know who I am, I'm a food and farming journalist. I work mainly for RT Radio, which is in the news for the wrong reasons at the moment. But really deep down on the ground, a lot of us there, as you probably know, are beavering away on much lower salaries than are presented in the papers and at PAC. So we keep doing the good work, and that's what it's all about. And one of the things that I've been following for, really, I suppose it reminded me today, when I first came across climate change as an issue, I was series producer on Ear to the Ground, and it was probably in the late 90s, I can't remember, I was trying to work out the year, that myself and Mairead McGuinness, who was presenting at the time, went to visit Dr. John Sweeney, Professor John Sweeney in Maynooth, who was really, when we look back, and he's an emeritus professor still, he really was a world leader in, I suppose, his foresight and his team's research on this topic, which was very, very new at the time. And he told us about methane emissions from bovines, and he told us how the atmosphere would eventually be so loaded with gases the climate will be changed and life on Earth may not even be possible. And I remember us thinking, this can't really be real, it's just too out there. It was too much to take on. But that was then, and we're in a very different place now, and it is real, and the window to act is getting tighter before those big, big changes come that perhaps make mitigation more difficult or impossible. So it's so important to see the third iteration of MACC here today, MACC 23, because this is the pathway to change. And if it's adopted, I think, and we'll hear more from Gary and we'll interrogate this as the morning goes on, if it's adopted by high numbers of farmers, it has a real chance of reducing our emissions, which is just fantastic and so hopeful. So I suppose what we're going to look at in terms of the plan of the morning is we'll have 3 presentations and 2 panel discussions. In the first panel, we're going to drill down into Teagasc's work itself and look more in detail at MACC 23, look at what's happening in terms of the 33 measures, look at land use, land change, and forestry, those sequestering options, the energy, discuss opportunities and challenges. And in the second panel, we'll really look at more what's happening at farm level. What's the implementation like at the moment, the Signpost programme, how to roll it out in farms, what's going to be feasible for people to do, and what are the next steps. So I'll waste no time in introducing our main act today, who really is remarkable in terms of what he's done with this programme, with obviously a lot of people feeding into it as well. The Principal Research Officer in Teagasc Crops, Environment and Land Use at Teagasc, and the author of the MACC 2023, Professor Gary Lanigan.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. Thanks to the Minister, the Chairman, Director, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for all turning up today. So I'm going to try and give you a whistle-stop tour through the MACC 2023. First things first is you can see there's a myriad of authors here. So I am simply standing on the shoulders of my colleagues who have carried out an awful lot of this research over the last 5 years, and also both within Teagasc and, in fact, the wider agri-food research sector. Okay, so what's a MACC and why do we need it? So a MACC, really marginal abatement cost curve, sets out in a visual way sets of mitigation options. It ranks those mitigation options in terms of cost benefit, so the least expensive to the most expensive. And really it's a way then for policymakers to be able to pick and choose which measures are going to be the most effective, which are going to be the most costly, which are the least costly. And really, it's to give stakeholders and policymakers a steer in terms of the most cost-effective measures. We produced our first MACC back in 2012, so 11 years ago now. The last one was in 2018. So the first MACC we produced was 50 pages. The second MACC, the big MACC, was 86 pages, and this is the whopper. It's 400 pages long. So as a result, of course, there is a myriad of new science in there. We have new science. Of course, the policy landscape over the last 5 years has really transformed, particularly in terms of sectoral targets. And as with the previous MACC, we have separate MACCs for agriculture, for land use change and forestry, and for bioenergy. Okay, so what's new? What are the key considerations? So the agriculture MACC, which will take up probably most of my talk today, but is in fact only about a third of the document, has 3 activity scenarios. So we look at 3 scenarios in terms of animal numbers. We have S1, which is our middle-of-the-road, business as usual, if you will, scenario. This is the scenario that is utilised by the Environmental Protection Agency in their forecasting of emissions into the future. We have 2 other scenarios. We have an S2 and an S3 scenario. I'll go into those in a minute. We also have, and something that's quite different from the previous MACC, is we have 2 adoption pathways. So we have pathway 1, which is a high adoption pathway, and pathway 2, which is a very, very high adoption pathway. So I apologise for the rather banal naming, but we couldn't come up with better names for them. Moderate and high, again, undersold how difficult pathway 1 was going to be. And as you see, as we go moving forward, you'll see exactly the levels of adoption that are going to be required. We also, different to the previous MACC, we have different speeds of uptake for different measures. So in the previous MACC, we assumed a linear uptake of measures from 2021 across to 2030. This time we tailor the uptake of measures depending on how new the measure is or how well known the measure is. So we front load some measures such as, for example, protected urea or low emission slurry spreading. And then for newer measures, such as feed additives, for example, we backload those measures in terms of uptake. This time as well, another thing we've done is to separate out the efficiency measures. So one thing when we were communicating the previous MACC that came across very quickly was the fact that we had lumped in the efficiency measures, and these are measures that reduce the carbon footprint but don't necessarily reduce absolute emissions. So these are things like animal health, genetics, extended grazing, dairy EBI, but dairy EBI is a little bit different, so I'll come back to that. So these reduce the carbon footprints, but they don't necessarily reduce absolute emissions. It's also important to just state that these measures are enablers for measures that do actually reduce absolute emissions, such as reduced age of finishing. So enough said with that, let's go on. We also then have another 2 MACCs, one for land use change, and one for energy. And we have one scenario for each of those. Okay, let's look at the agricultural activity scenarios. So these have been generated by my colleagues, Kevin Hanrahan and Trevor Donlan, using the FAPRI model. And essentially, what these are projections as to where we see agricultural numbers being, both in terms of the national herd and fertiliser use out to 2030. So if you look at scenario 1, we see in general a 5% drop in total bovine numbers, an 8% increase in dairy cow numbers, 29% decrease in suckler cow numbers, and a 16% increase in fertiliser use. If we look at scenario 2 then, so this is the lower activity numbers, we see an 8% reduction in total bovines, again a 4% increase in dairy cow numbers, a 43% decrease in suckler cow numbers, and 7% increase in fertiliser. And finally then, with scenario 3, which is the stretch, and the upper end of activity numbers, again, there's still a decrease in the total amount of bovines, then 1.5%, 12% increase in dairy cow numbers, 15% decrease in suckler cow numbers, and a 23% increase in nitrogen. Okay. The next thing that I get constantly is, and I got this constantly particularly from some of our farming stakeholders, is you guys in Teagasc make your grass very difficult. So the first thing I want to do is give you a quick lesson on how to read a MACC. So first of all, the width of the bar is probably the most important thing. So the width of the bar indicates the amount of greenhouse gases that are abated. The height of the bar indicates the cost of the measure. And if the bar is below the x-axis, then it's happy days, it's cost negative. So here is the agricultural MACC. And again, this is for the scenario 1 activity data numbers, and this is pathway 1. So the headline is that it reduces emissions under the pathway 1 adoption levels by 2,820 kilotons, 2.8 million tonnes in old money. And really the first thing that struck me is that there is no silver bullet. There's no one measure that will give you a big reduction, okay? There are, however, a number of measures to point out. First of all, reduced age of finishing is in fact the most prominent measure, 16% of the total. Next one, fertiliser formulation. This is moving from calcium ammonium nitrate or straight urea to a protected urea product. Also moving from high nitrate compounds, the likes of 28, 2.5, 5, down to moving to an ammonium-based compound such as 10-10-20 or 18-6-12. dairy EBI. And this is a big difference from the previous MACC, because what we found now is that, in fact, higher EBI animals have lower methane emissions. And finally, again, we have feed additives, and this is now a new measure, and this will come on stream very much towards the back end of the decade. So what we'll do now is we will listen to some of my colleagues who will talk us through the impact of both animal genetics and reduced state of finishing.
Breeding is a well-proven technology to deliver sustainable cumulative gains in performance, which can remain permanent in a population. Breeding programs represent no additional cost to the farmer and require no change to day-to-day farm management. Ireland has national dairy, beef and sheep breeding indexes which aim to improve the environmental, social and economic sustainability metrics of the respective sectors. These indexes are improving the environmental credentials of the sectors while at the same time delivering safe, nutritious and healthy food for consumers. Recent research at Teagasc has clearly demonstrated that the higher genetic merit dairy cows are 14% more carbon efficient in producing milk. Interestingly, they don't produce any more methane than their lower genetic merit counterparts, but they produce significantly more milk solids. Research is well underway in cattle and sheep to understand the extent of the genetic differences in methane produced per animal, and how best to breed for lower emitting animals within the framework of greater economic efficiencies.
Donna highlighted the greenhouse gas emissions and financial benefits achieved through genetic progress. From the perspective of beef breeding, reducing age at finish has been identified as a key trait to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions while improving farm profitability. The beef breeding programme has contributed to reducing finishing age in the beef herd by approximately 1 week per year over the last decade, largely through progress in traits such as live weight gain and maternal weaning weight. Indeed, a new age at finish trait has been developed and included in the beef breeding indexes to further accelerate this gain. In addition to genetics, finishing age will require an intensive knowledge transfer campaign to reassert the importance of the critical farm management practices which lead to higher animal live weight performance and earlier finishing. Animal health, particularly in early life, and optimal feeding programs will be key elements. Maximising performance from grazed pastures, including grass clover systems, is critical to ensure performance targets are met. Greater use of sex semen in the dairy herd will also have a positive benefit of reducing finishing age by increasing the proportion of early maturing dairy beef progeny. In summary, age at finish is not a trait solely for finishing systems, it's an outcome of management from birth in suckler and dairy beef systems.
So next we will hear from Professor Sinead Waters, who's leading our research on feed additives.
The importance of feed additives for reducing methane emissions is clearly outlined in the new MACC. There has been major progress with a range of methane inhibiting feed additives, including seaweeds, oils, 3-NOP and halides, to reduce enteric methane emissions. They have been evaluated in Teagasc using in vitro, sheep and beef and dairy trials. To be successful, feed additives need to consistently reduce methane, be safe, be cost effective, be easy to deliver, leave no residues in meat or milk products, be accountable in our national inventory and have no negative effects on animal performance. 3-NOP, commercially known as Bovaer, is a synthetic, non-toxic compound that inhibits the final step in methane production. Trials at Teagasc Grange found that it reduces methane emissions by 30% in beef cattle indoors with no negative impacts on performance. Preliminary research results from Moore Park indicate that there is a 7% reduction in methane when 3-NOP was fed to grazing animals twice daily during milking. Galway-based Glassport Bio, in collaboration with Teagasc, have developed a feed additive called Rumanglas. Rumanglas reduce methane emissions by 28% when fed twice daily to beef bulls and there were no negative effects on performance or on animal health. A major advantage is that this feed additive can be formulated into a pelleted feed. Our current research now is focused on the reformulation of feed additives to generate slow release and bolus formats for application in beef and dairy grazing systems, and will evaluate cost and any benefits.
We've heard a little bit about some of the measures that we have. So again, probably the thing you're asking is, how does pathway 1 in terms of adoption rate, how does that impact on our total emissions? Okay, so here we have pathway 1 reduces emissions by 2.8 million tonnes. Here's our target by 2030, 17.25 million tonnes of CO2 equivalents per annum. And the answer is, it doesn't make it. Okay, so we end up by 2030 with emissions of somewhere in the region of about 19 million tonnes. Okay, so that's pathway 1, that's our high level of adoption. So let's move on to our very high level of adoption, pathway 2. And what does that generate? So again, just to draw your attention, the x-axis has now changed in terms of its scale. And what you see with the very high levels of adoption is you see a reduction of just under 5 million tonnes, 4,858 kilotonnes per annum by 2030. And again, the main measures, again, I'll draw your attention to. First of all, we've been far more ambitious within pathway 2 with feed additives. So here we're implementing feed additives during grazing to about half the dairy herd, and then to about 65% of the bovines during the housing period. Again, reduced age of finishing is accounting for somewhere in the region of about 15% of that reduction. So reduced age of finishing across both uptake pathways is going to be very, very important. Fertiliser formulation, again, somewhere in the region of about 13–14% of our total emissions reduction. But here, we're scaling up the ambition. I'll go into that a little bit later. And finally, we have then a new set of measures that come in, and these are the impacts of diversification within the agri-food sector. And in particular, what impacts on diversification is reaching the stretch target of producing feedstock for 5.7 terawatts of biomethane. That utilises about 120,000 hectares of grassland and may result in displacement of animals somewhere in the region of about 139,000 livestock units. So what we will now hear from is my colleague Fiona Thorne, who will guide us through some of those diversification impacts. The next thing, just before I come on to Fiona, the target again, 17.25 million tonnes per year. Can we reach it with the stretch targets? The answer is yes. Okay, we can reach not only the target in the year 2030, but also the cumulative mitigation across both of the carbon budgets. Okay, most of the heavy lifting will be done during the second budget. But again, a lot of the targets, particularly in terms of nitrogen use, will be during the first carbon budget. So now I'll hand over to Fiona that will guide you through diversification.
The Teagasc MACC report looks at these diversification options in more detail. A shift to organic production systems, producing feedstocks for bioenergy production, expansion of the national tillage area and increased deforestation. So let's look at some of these options in more detail. First off, if we take organics, there are EU and Irish specific targets for an increase in organic production over the medium term. We can already see the rapid increase in farmers currently converting to organic systems, aided by the increased support available through the Organic Farming Scheme. The more widespread adoption of organic systems would result in increased uptake of legumes, reduced nitrogen usage, and also reduced stocking densities in some cases. Another diversification option which has received much attention in recent times is biomethane and the production of sustainable biomass feedstocks. It is estimated that a total land area of 120,000 hectares will be needed to produce the silage to feed the AD biomethane plants required to reach the 5.7 terawatt target. We are here in Teagasc Grange today, the site of the new Teagasc pilot-scale anaerobic digestion facility. Teagasc has ongoing research investigating the sustainable production of AD feedstocks, including improving the sustainability of digestate and valorisation as a fertiliser replacement. Diversification options also exist within horticulture. For example, apple production has been identified nationally as a possible diversification opportunity. There is also an increased focus on value added within the tillage sector, with Teagasc carrying out significant research to develop higher value markets for plant products via fractionation and establishing a new brewing and distilling centre in Teagasc Oak Park. In summary, the new MACC has included diversification of farming activities, which may offer farmers alternative income streams, while also reducing emissions that result from partial destocking.
So Fiona has detailed again some of those diversification measures that we'll touch on again actually as we move forward. So can agriculture meet its targets? So here you can see the matrix of animal numbers times uptake pathways, and the ones to really zone in on here is that under scenario 1, which again is an 8% increase in dairy cow numbers, and scenario 2, which is a 4% increase in dairy cow numbers, but then of course total bovine numbers down from where they are at the moment. Both of these scenarios will get you to the target, but only under the pathway 2 levels of adoption. Okay, and I know there's probably some people in the audience will say, that's great. We can make our targets wonderful. Okay, well, let's explore the levels of adoption that are required. Okay, so pathway 1 is here, but I would encourage you to actually forget about pathway 1 and concentrate on pathway 2. What you're looking at is a 30% reduction in the total amount of nitrogen by 2030, 100% of straight urea replaced with protected urea, over 90% of calcium ammonium nitrate replaced with protected urea, 65% of nitrate-based compounds replaced with ammonium-based compounds, reducing the age of finishing by 3 months en masse across the beef herd, and a higher adoption of sex semen. In terms of feed additives, a 50% adoption during grazing within the dairy herd, and a 65% adoption within the total number of bovines during the housing period. A displacement of somewhere in the region of 138,000 livestock units, and then the use of slurry aeration and also acidification of manure and other manure management measures on 40% of dairy farms, 20% of others. And again, I would say when we're talking about slurry aeration, we're talking about new aerators, not the old-fashioned aerators in the system, because that produces a lot of ammonia. So very, very high levels of adoption. Let's now move on to land use change. Again, we have 2 adoption pathways. Adoption pathway 1 delivers somewhere in the region of about 2 million tonnes, 2267 kilotons of reduction by the year 2030. Pathway 2, essentially almost double the amount of mitigation, somewhere in the region of 4 million tonnes by 2030. And again, you can see there's a myriad of measures that help us achieve that target. The first ones I will point to is, of course, the water table management. Okay, I dislike the term re-wetting. It's not re-wetting. It is lifting the water table, but it doesn't necessarily mean flooding. Second is grassland management on mineral soils, and also the establishment of new hedgerows, the better management of existing hedgerows, so allow your hedgerows to grow out a metre or so and up a couple of metres. And then we have a myriad of forestry measures. First thing I would draw your attention to is afforestation looks like it's not doing a whole lot, right? You ask yourself why. The reason being is that by the year 2030, even if we implement a target of somewhere in the region about 8,000 hectares of forestry planting per annum, it's only going to deliver somewhere in the region about 200,000 tonnes of mitigation. However, for 2050, it's very, very important to get our afforestation rates up. Okay? The difference between a 2,500 hectare per annum forestry rate and an 8,000 hectare per annum forestry rate is somewhere in the region of 2 million tonnes by 2050. So what we're talking about here is also forestry management on our current forestry stock, particularly lengthening the age of current rotations. And we'll hear from Tom now about some of our forestry measures.
The Climate Action Plan 2023 targets the urgent need for increased annual afforestation of 8,000 hectares, while also enhancing the capacity of existing forests to act as important carbon sinks, helping to address long-term climate change. The new MACC highlights the importance of appropriate forest management while avoiding deforestation if we want to reduce emissions before 2030. In addition, afforestation will positively contribute to 2030 targets and will be critical in supporting emission reduction targets in the 2030 to 2050 period. In order to achieve the planting targets and the substantial carbon capture potential of forests, significant advice and support for farmers around the critical issues of tree species selection, forest establishment and management, and financial decision-making is essential. Our forestry research and advice supports decision-making on forest operations and sustainable forest management practices. It enhances the capacity of forest owners to improve forest growth, productivity, and timber quality, contributing to strong carbon sinks. Where appropriate, timely thinning in both conifer and broadleaf species concentrates growth on trees of superior quality, providing the means to improve the conversion of timber to long-lived harvested wood products. Our research also investigates how forest management approaches can integrate timber production with climate and biodiversity goals through practices such as agroforestry and continuous cover forest management approaches.
So just to have a look at where our emissions are going within LULUCF, what we can see, and there's a big difference between AG and LULUCF, because with LULUCF, our emissions in the absence of mitigation are going to rise quite substantially into the future. We have a hard target at the moment, which is an effort-sharing regulation target from the EU of a 13.6 reduction in emissions from the sector by 2030. Pathway 1 doesn't get you there. Pathway 2 just about gets you there. I would bear in mind that any emissions reduction beyond about 14% would be very, very difficult. Lastly, I'll talk about bioenergy very quickly. Here, it's a little bit different because there's two measures that dominate: the use of wood energy, such as sawmill residues, and also forestry thinnings as a substitution for fossil fuels. And the second is the biomethane target of 5.7 terawatt hours. The one thing about the biomethane is it is highly, highly sensitive to gas prices. So at a high gas price, you can see it's cost beneficial measure. but at a low gas price, i.e. gas prices prior to 2021, it's a costly measure. Okay, so again, huge volatility in gas prices deliver very different results in terms of cost benefit. Finally, the key messages. Agriculture sectoral targets can be achieved by 2030, but it will require very high adoption rates. As a result of that, really increased advisory and extension services, and I'm looking at Stan Lawler here in the audience, whose job really starts now, and all of his team in the advisory service, Tom Curran, etc. Really getting adoption on the ground is going to be key. The MACC is not a production system. It is a menu of options, and really what we need now is to translate these options into production systems for dairy, beef, tillage, sheep, etc. Reductions in LULUCF are possible. In order to get reductions of greater than about 14% will require new science, both in terms of inventory refinement and in terms of new mitigation. Agriculture and land use sourced bioenergy can significantly contribute to wider decarbonisation, particularly in the energy sectors. And finally, continued research and development will be key to getting new measures into the future, and also, again, a MACC is only a snapshot in time. It's a very fluid environment we have, and what we really will require is high adoption rates and new levels of science. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary, for that brilliant presentation. It really is the meat part of the day. There's so much in it. We have to thank all the authors, all the scientists involved, and Gary for delivering it so well and actually making it quite palatable to people even outside the scientific community like myself. It's so exciting as well. It is, as you say, a set of options, and we'll talk about how we can maybe deliver on those set of options at farm level later in the day. But first we're going to hear from Dr. Pat Toohey, and Pat is a Senior Research Officer in the Animal and Grassland Research and Innovation Programme at Teagasc. And Gary mentioned how wetting is a really, really scary term for lots of Irish farmers who spent generations trying to get water out of fields and improve what they were doing. So really that idea of water table management is key to the next steps we're going to take. And Pat's chat is going to be all of that now. So please welcome him, and we'll come back to our panel after Pat.
Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne, and thanks to the earlier speakers who mentioned this topic. I'll be discussing the drainage status of grassland peat soils. I'd like to acknowledge the other co-authors of this study, Owen Fenton, Lillian O'Sullivan and Conor Bracken. I suppose the reason this is significant, hopefully will come to light in the next few minutes for you all, those who aren't familiar, but I suppose this table sets the background to the LULUCF sector in terms of the total emissions, so land use change and forestry, as Gary had described. The table is a bit of a league table, going from the highest contributing elements, the categories, to the lowest. And you'll notice there's minus figures at the bottom of the table, so those land uses, cropland, which includes short rotation grassland, forestry and grassland on mineral soils are actually sequestering carbon. The other numbers are positive, and if you go up to the top of the table, the big number, 9 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent per annum, is the emissions from grassland on peat soils. The total, when you add up the numbers in that last column, comes to 7.25 million tonnes. So obviously 9 is the major contribution there, and that's from the grassland peat soils. That 9 million figure, though, is uncertain. and that uncertainty is recognised in the national inventory reporting, but I suppose when the headline figures come out and the small print sometimes tends to be forgotten about or ignored, but it is quite clear in the inventory report that that number is uncertain. The reason it's uncertain is based on what's in the graphic on the left. All those different elements combine to come up with the 9 million figure. So the extent of peat and what proportion of it is under grassland is uncertain. The drainage status, which I'll be concentrating on, is uncertain. The nutrient status is uncertain, and the associated emission factors then, which are a result of the other colourful labels there, are also as a result uncertain. All those elements are subject to ongoing research to try and refine that proportion or that element of the LULUCF inventory. What it ultimately boils down to is the area of the grassland peat soils is estimated to be 335,000 hectares. We're obliged by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, if water table level on these soils is unknown, we must assume that it is deep drained, which means that we assume that the mean water table is at least 30 centimetres below the surface, which presents us with very high emissions, because the deeper the water table is in these soils, the more opportunity they have for the organic matter to decompose, and the higher the emissions are as a result. The associated emission factors is about 26 tonnes per hectare from that land use, which is the rate of carbon that's emitted from these soils. And if you multiply the 26 by the 335, you'll get to your 9 million fairly quick. So that's the basis of the number. But it's that assumption that the water table level is unknown, or that we don't have enough information to move from a default position, is what we've argued and started to argue for in the recent publication, which is why I'm introducing this today. The publication was in the Journal of Environmental Management 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it's focused on drainage status, as I mentioned. To go back, and these aren't organic soils or peat soils, these are mineral soils, but for those of you who haven't handled the business end of a spade in the name of land drainage, you might want to, I suppose, consider what land drainage is ultimately about. It's putting in a series of either open or closed buried pipe drains across the land to try and control the water table. The depth and spacing and layout of those drains is put in such a way, or designed in such a way, to control the water table. And if you're not controlling the water table, then from a hydrology point of view, you don't have water table control, you don't have effective land drainage. And I suppose myself and others, the other authors I mentioned, have a good bit of experience in terms of the land drainage issue for the last number of years. And I suppose internal chats, we were asking ourselves if that assumption regarding drainage status on peat soils is justifiable, and can we come up with a counter argument to say that we have information that would provide new information to try and, as I said, refine that inventory. The image there that you're looking at again is a graphic which is a simplification or an illustration of the idea I talked about in terms of water table control. The two circles at the bottom are illustrating field drains, and the blue arches between them are the water table position. The water table position is lowest where the drains are, and as you move away from the drain, the water table gets close to the surface. The more difficult the soil is to drain, the more it holds onto or wants to hold onto the water, the more intensively spaced those drains have to be to achieve water table control. In terms of difficult soils to drain, it's fair to say that peat soils or organic soils are right up there. So I suppose the answer to our question that's posed at the top of the slide, our own view was that no, the peat soils, in peats, the area impacted by open or field drains is very limited, 1 to 5 metres away from the drain. That impact is effectively zero. As a result, the effective drainage of peats is technically difficult, and you can replace synonymous there with expensive. Lots of money has to be spent to drain these soils effectively. And ultimately the extent of drainage assumed for the emissions estimates isn't feasible. So that's all well and good to have that concept or have that understanding in our own small team, but I suppose to present that, and again, we're bound in terms of the ground rules by the IPCC, and to change the inventory or to propose a change to the inventory, we need a certain level of evidence to try and counteract, I suppose, the status quo or the default position. We're, I suppose, lucky in that, as I said, there's a small team of us now currently working or working partially in terms of land drainage, but historically, on First to Luntis, the forerunner to Teagasc, and indeed Teagasc, has a long history in terms of the soil survey work and the soil physics department, land drainage works that were at the peak, I suppose, of their powers back in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And there's a number of publications shown there on the screen, and you've seen dates there, so they're before my time, maybe not before everyone in the room's time, but they're before my time anyway. And they show, I suppose, a lot of work that went on at the time in terms of land drainage research work, and particularly those ones focused on peat soils. We've gathered these national studies that were archived, that were some of them that were available digitally, most of them that were stockpiled here, there and everywhere, and compile them to try and build a body of evidence to try and come up with a counter-argument for the current default position. There's over 150 references in the paper, which takes the form of a review. So we're building all those evidence together. A lot of these reports, it might not be the headline or the front page of the report, but somewhere buried in the back of these reports, there's some very useful figures to try and build our argument, I suppose, on this topic. So evidence is what we're building, and these are just a few snippets. A paper from 1978 again recognises what we can recognise in the ground. There's fundamental problems associated with peat drainage, effective peat drainage. A spacing of 1 to 4 metres is required for water table control. Such spacings would not have been imposed widely in practice. A paper from 1969, as they're not economically justifiable, and then that's the cost issue there again. More recent studies would recognise the issue around maintenance. So in circumstances where there's rural depopulation, changing input costs, very wet or difficult sites to drain, these sites aren't necessarily maintained. So there may be drainage that was installed at some point, or a degree of drainage, but it's not functioning as we speak, or not continuing to function without another round of drainage works or another level of investment in the site. This was an interesting one, I suppose, that cropped up from a conference paper in 1986. Liam Galvin published this, or produced a figure, and it was one of the very few documented figures in terms of the actual area drained. 50 to 70,000 hectares is the figure. And there's two reasons, I suppose, that's an important study. One, because the period that's outlined, 1948 to 85, was a period when there was recognised to be a huge amount of drainage because there was grant aid available and various other incentives that were there at the time. So that was the core period when drainage work was being done. And because the person in question, Liam Galvin, spent most of his career up to that point out around the country, leading what was called at the time the Land Drainage Survey, which surveyed 50,000 hectares of all soil types. But again, this guy wasn't pulling this number from it was a very educated estimate in terms of those numbers. I'm not going to go through 150 snippets, but you get the general idea of what we're putting together, or what we did put together in the paper. So ultimately, what the conclusion we're coming to is that review counters the idea that drainage status is unknown, and in fact we do, once you look in the right places and put together a reasoned argument on this topic, we do know quite a lot in terms of what the likely position is in terms of these soils and their drainage status. So what we've done then, quite simply, is a number of scenarios. So we establish a range of scenarios with regard to the actual drainage status of these soils. We allow, obviously, for additional drained areas since 1985, which again are undocumented, but we pull together various assumptions, and we come up with a new drained area in the range of 90 to 120,000 hectares, significantly lower than the 335 figure that's currently the default figure that's used for emissions estimates. If you run the numbers on that, and the scenarios again are quite simple, the main thrust of the paper is building the evidence. The scenarios or the changes are down the line, I suppose, but the figures we came up with were 3.6 to 4.7 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent, a saving of up to 60% on the 9 million figure, but more research is required to refine all those factors. Under the heading of more research, I just want a slide or two on this re-wet project, and again, like Gary mentioned, we're probably sorry we went with that name, given the controversy that's out there in terms of the term and the idea of flooding of these soils that seems to be embedded now in a lot of people's heads. The IPCC again defines re-wetting as the undermining or blocking of artificial drainage. It doesn't impose, despite what you would hear, it doesn't impose a water table depth, it doesn't impose a target water table depth. It's the blocking of artificial drainage. Where the water table ends up is irrelevant, and certainly not dictating that it be above the surface. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent, but the re-wet project is a project that's funded by the Department of Agriculture, which is worth recognising today. It's also partnered with the University of Galway, and it's looking at current drainage status, so hydrology on grassland peat soils, and it's looking at, if we're manipulating the water table, how do we go about that? how to control the water table, where you might best impose changes, what the cost would be and what the impact would be on the land in question and adjacent land. There's a number of measurements. If you look at the sites there's lots of colourful pins indicating where measurements are going on. They're focused on water table depth, soil moisture, discharge from the sites, rainfall, water quality. So there's a lot of data being collected on these sites. If we revisit this table briefly, and I've taken liberties of swapping out the 9 million figure for the 3.6 million figure, and you can see the effect that would have on the total number at the bottom, moving from 7.25 to 1.85. That's in a world where all the other numbers on the table don't move, which, as Gary outlined a minute ago, they are all moving, and particularly the forestry is moving in the wrong direction in terms of that number. So look, the final numbers are not necessarily just dependent on the 9 million changing, but there is obviously, you can see there, all else being equal, you can see the potential significance of a change. It's now, I suppose, up to the Environmental Protection Agency, who have responsibility for the national inventory, to consider what we've proposed and consider including it in the updated or the next round of updates to the inventory. So that's everything for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pat. Very, very interesting, and definitely something that could change a lot in the figures as we go forward, and something I'm sure that will come up later today. I'd like to welcome now the first panel up to the stage. So we'll have Gary back, Professor Gary Lanigan, to dig deeper, obviously, into MACC 23. We'll have Dr. Fiona Thorne, who's Principal Research Officer in Teagasc Rural Economy and Development Programme, and she's mainly going to focus on diversification. Professor Dunneberry, we saw him in the video earlier talking about breeding, and we're going to focus in on that with him in terms of how it impacts the MACC 23. And Dr. Lillian O'Sullivan, Senior Research Officer in Teagasc Crops, Environment and Land Use Programme, and she's going to talk about that LULUCF, that land use sequestering, and where we go next with that. So welcome to the stage, everyone. Thank you. Take your seats there. So what we're going to do is talk for about 25 minutes and then open it up to the floor. So make a note of questions or points you would like to ask. Gary, we might go to you first. I mean, there's so much there. It's almost, where do you even begin? Nitrogen, is that something that stands out as a first step that really highlights it to me and maybe everyone in the room as something to deliver on first?
Yeah, Suzanne. So I suppose in terms of the weapons that we have in our armoury, really we have two carbon budgets that we have to focus on. First one, 2021 to 2025, so we're about halfway through that, and then 26 to 30. And really during the first carbon budget, it's focusing on reducing nitrogen emissions. We're quite fortunate that our national inventory is quite well advanced in terms of nitrous oxide. Most of that research spearheaded by my friend and colleague Carl Richards back in the day, and Patrick Forrestal, with a lot of guidance I might add from the Environmental Protection Agency, particularly Dr. Bernard Hyde and Paul Duffy. And really what we're looking at there is reducing nitrogen fertiliser. How do we do that? First of all, get your soil pH correct. So 2/3 of our soils are suboptimal pH. Get your pH right. Secondly, get your soil P&K index right. Again, some of the work that Carl has been doing has shown that at index 3, you have lower nitrous oxide emissions than at index 1, P index 1 and P index 2. Then on top of that, use legumes. So fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So about 30% clover in your sward will fix somewhere in the region of 80 to 120 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. And again, our colleagues in Moore Park, Mick O'Donovan, is doing an awful lot of research on that. And also multi-species swards again. My colleague John Finn in Johnstown is spearheading a lot of the work on multi-species swards. And so they're the measures to reduce nitrogen. But, one thing I would say is, using more lime without reducing nitrogen is actually going to make the problem worse. So you have to scale back your nitrogen use by the amount of nitrogen you're freeing up, either by getting your pH correct, the use of legumes, the use of low emission slurry spreading, etc. So it's really going hard at reducing the amount of nitrogen fertiliser. And if you do have to apply nitrogen fertiliser, then don't use calcium ammonium nitrate. I mean, calcium ammonium nitrate is the Rolls Royce of fertilisers. You know, it costs an awful lot. Protected urea, we have shown, Patrick Forrestal and my colleague in John St. Castle has shown time and again that protected urea works just as well as calcium ammonium nitrate, and it's cheaper. The nitrous oxide emissions are a third of those from calcium ammonium nitrate, and it has low ammonia emissions. So switching from calcium ammonium nitrate to straight urea, yes, reduces nitrous oxide emissions, but you end up with more ammonia. So you have to move to a protected urea product or move to an ammonium-based compound. So really, that's the first key. After that then, in the second commitment period from 26 to 30, I think what we're going to do there is really start to tackle methane through improved animal genetics, particularly dairy EBI, beef genetics, Donal will talk about that, but also then the use of feed additives. So the use of 3-NOP, the use of halides, the use of dietary lipids are really going to move to the fore towards the end of the decade.
And by then, even, you know, in 5 years, you might be looking at products that are really even more successful than the ones that are on the marketplace now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, the one thing I would say, and the thing I kind of dislike about MACCs, and I do MACCs quite a bit, is that it's a snapshot in time. So the measures that might be costly now might be a whole lot cheaper in 2, 3, 4 years' time.
Fiona, in terms of diversification, what are the policies at the moment that are working and that are going to be expanded, obviously, in MACC 23?
Okay, Suzanne, so the diversification, the first thing that I want to say about that is that it's probably one of the measures that includes so much compared to anything else that Gary has explained in the MACC so far. So when we're talking about diversification, we're speaking to the actions that are in the Climate Action Plan and then being enacted within the MACC. So we're talking about things like biomethane, we're talking about organics, we're talking about forestry, and we're talking about an increase in the tillage area. And across all of those 4 sub-programmes within diversification, we have policies which are in place, which are working. But I always say about diversification, we've done a lot, but we have a lot more to do, okay? So we've had some success with policies, we've had some success with adoption, but if we are to meet the targets which are laid down in the Climate Action Plan, if we're to reach the adoption levels that Gary talks about, specifically in pathway number 2, we have a lot more that we have to do. We have to talk about ramping up adoption. We have to talk about not just the policies that are in place at the moment, but also new policies. So just to give you some examples of those. So if we talk about the biomethane targets that we have within the Climate Action Plan, that 5.7 terawatt hours, we need things like the biomethane strategy, which DAFM and DEC are putting together at the moment and which stakeholders are contributing to. We need that to be rolled out. We know that there are financial incentives that will have to be put in place, not just for the capital side of things, but for the ongoing operationalisation and adoption of that probably 150 or 200 AD plants across the country. And then moving on and looking at some of the other diversification opportunities, if we talk about the tillage area, the Food Vision group of the 2030 targets that we have there, they are now being looked at seriously, and we have the Food Vision tillage group, which are looking at putting policies and recommending policies that will help us increase that tillage area to the 400,000 hectares and help us achieve those diversification targets. If we look at organics, we have the new organic farming scheme, and we saw a large increase in the applicants. For me, a key take-home message of the applicants to that organic farming scheme this year, which was really optimistic, is that we had nearly a 2 to 1-fold increase in the number of new applicants to the organic farming scheme.
And then the other one, the afforestation, I might let Lillian talk a little bit more about that, because the thing about the increase in the forest area, it covers not just the agricultural MACC, which Gary talked about, but it also spans the other MACCs that have been outlined, specifically the LULUCF. So I'd summarise by saying, Suzanne, look, we have a lot done, but we're realistic. Everybody in this room knows that we have a lot more to do on diversification. But there are good opportunities there, not just on the economic side, but on the environmental and social sustainability, if we are successful on diversification.
Absolutely, and it's a vast area. Each topic alone you could do half a day on, in terms of that diversification options and enhancing people's decisions to make diversification part of what they're doing. Donna, the breeding, I was looking there in your video, the higher genetic merit dairy cows. It's easy to do. Why aren't we seeing more people do it?
I think it's people are using it from an EBI perspective. Like when Gary showed up the slide about the pathways and the adoption rates, one of the things that wasn't in there was actually breeding. Because one of the beauties of breeding is you don't need to change your farming system. So it's easy to do a good ram or a bad or a good bull compared to a good or bad ram or bull as well. So it doesn't require change to farm management practices. It's no additional cost to the system. It's a proven technology, which I think is really important. So we have years of evidence to prove that this thing works. It definitely is those breeding indexes. So we have national breeding indexes for dairy, beef and sheep. They're the most scrutinised indexes in the world. So we've used control studies. We've analysed national databases at an animal level and analysed databases at a herd level, and they consistently show that animals that are genetically superior outperform their genetically inferior animals. Like if we look at just the economic breeding index, the one that Gary talked a lot about, what we call the EBI. So there's an index that every animal in the country, every dairy animal in the country gets. The higher the value, the more profitable it is. It's addressing the three legs of the sustainable food system stool. So it's economically, it was under the line from Gary's perspective. It had a good wide bar, so it's addressing environmental sustainability and also social sustainability. The expectation is a €1 difference in EBI equates to a €2 difference in profit. When we do the analysis, irrespective of the year, irrespective of the geographical location, it equates to around 1.92 to 1.96 euros. So it's more or less exactly as our expectation. So it actually is a no-brainer. But the real beauty is that you get 100% adoption rate. Can we go faster? Certainly. So right, we have new technologies. Sex semen is the big one coming to the fore. So that, and that is really, I think, where a lot of this advancements, or if we're going to modify this MACC for the next MACC, is where I think a lot of the change is going to be, is the adoption of sex semen to more intensely select our animals.
I know the winners of the NDC Quality Milk Awards last year, the Keneally family. When I went to them, people might be familiar with them. They were brand new entrants into dairy farming. They had a mixed farm before, beef and tillage. They really started off from scratch, and what they did was they bought high EBI heifers, and they went straight in with them, earning more, carrying less animals on the farm, and cows that perform better. It just seems a no-brainer, but the adoption, how could you make the adoption faster?
So artificial insemination. So like one of it's easy. You can decompose genetic gain into four main factors, right? And three of these you can change. One is what we call the intensity of selection. Do you select the top 1% of your cows or the top 50% of your cows, or ewes, as the case may be? And sex semen enables you to actually increase that intensity of selection. When we come looking at beef, and more so in sheep, it's the use of artificial insemination. So can we increase that level of artificial insemination in the beef and particularly in the sheep, or else use those genetically elite animals? The second one then is the accuracy. So those heifers have these EBI figures. They're 30% reliable. Can we get them to be 60, 70, 80% reliable? And that's where, if we look directly at their DNA, their genotype, that will increase the accuracy of selection. And that's one of the fundamental reasons for this national genotyping plan, is to accelerate the rate of genetic gain by having more accurate evaluations on individual animals, which enable us to do greater selection intensity. And that's on the female side, and then we do the same on the male side.
Because it's quite a big slice of progress on the MACC, isn't it, the genetic side?
Yeah, and to be maybe a little bit arrogant about it, Gary's is up to 2030. But another real of the beauties of animal breeding is it is cumulative and arguably permanent. So
yes.
If you stop those other technologies, you can revert back to base. You don't do that from breeding. It holds that benefit that Gary has shown. And while we talk about animal breeding being slow, which it can be in some instances, and Gary alluded to it, we need to also think about 2050. Because once we get over 2030, we have 2050. And that's where that cumulative benefit that we're building on generation by generation will materialise.
You've more quality livestock across the country. Lillian, LULUCF, explain it again briefly to people, and looking at one thing that came up on the charts there in terms of MACC, not just the obvious ones, but stuff like hedgerows and the carbon sequestering of things that we might look at that need much more investment in terms of our care.
Okay, so LULUCF is land use change and forestry, and I suppose the first thing to say about it is that the land sector is different because it does have capacity to sequester and store carbon in biomass and soils. But what that means for most EU member states is that the land sector is a sink. However, as we've already seen this morning, that's not the case in Ireland. And if we continue with the business as usual or nothing changes, then we stand to have 10.5 million tonne of CO2 equivalent in 2030. So we are confronted with quite a challenge with that, but I think a key message is that it's a very dynamic sector and there's a huge amount of uncertainty associated with that. We've already seen the uncertainty shown in both of the presentations, particularly in the second presentation by Pat Toohey. But I suppose if you can imagine that for every land use change, for every management that's applied on that land use, interacting with a different soil type is going to have either a different emission factor or a land sequestration benefit associated with it. So there's a huge challenge in getting those measurements right, and I think on the positive side, it's very important to say that there's a huge amount of work ongoing within Teagasc and in collaboration with others to try and really get a handle on some of that uncertainty. We have our National Agricultural Soils Carbon Observatory towers that are out there across the country now getting some measurements, but also then those on the ground, what's happening with farm management on farms in terms of the Signpost programme, to be able to better characterise what's happening in terms of that sector. Importantly, just to refer as well to what Fiona said in relation to afforestation, what's different between the last MACC and this MACC is that, afforestation would have been a big sink in our previous MACCs. We see now that the age of the profile, refined emission factors of forestry and organic soils, all of this, and low planting rates are really what's different, I suppose, in terms of the potential of that, which would have been very important. But I must stress that while we have a 2030 target, we also have a 2050 climate horizon point out to the future. We have a national sectoral ceiling for agriculture. That's yet to be set for the land sector. So then it comes back to all of those things that we have, like hedgerows. We have about 690,000 kilometres of hedgerow across the country. So that's already something that's there on farms. And for the first time now, we can include that as part of the MACC because we have values that allow us to assign a potential value not only to new hedgerows but also associated with the management. So what you find out there is that there's a marked difference between what we call two main types of hedgerows. So we have these very intensively managed hedgerows, and then we have these less intensive ones that Gary referred to earlier, that if we allow more biomass to accumulate, effectively you're allowing for greater sequestration of carbon to happen. So that's a new measure that we have now included. Again, that's something that's really reliant, and we're working hard in collaboration with the advisory side of the house to really drive some of those things that already are there that we can optimise, because reaching our targets also requires us to reverse sink loss, and that's management of existing hedgerows would fall into that category, certainly. So again, now working with advisory, we have a hedgerow week programme that's become very successful. It's growing year on year. And also, of course, it's something that is supported through agri-environmental schemes. So it's really looking at what are those options that are out there that we can optimise. and also acknowledging that, things like cropland, it's a limited area, so the amount of potential, unless we do increase some of the area and so forth, all of that has to be taken into consideration.
Okay, brilliant. We're going to turn over to the floor now if people would like to ask some questions. We have a mic going around. There's a gentleman here. There's two along the front if there's a mic coming down to you. And if you could say maybe where you're from or from what kind of agency or platform, or if you're farming, and who you'd like to direct the question to would be great as well. So just go to, you can go first.
McGann, I'm a farmer. Animal health was charged with 7.5% on the original MACC. It seems to have been relegated. Is there could animal health not contribute quite a bit more if we gave it its own identity on the MACC?
Yeah. So again, if you go and read the actual document, you'll see we have an efficiency MACC, and that's actually where we have animal health in there. And animal health does contribute an awful lot in terms of reducing the carbon footprint of both dairy and beef. I suppose the difficulty with animal health as an absolute measure, if your animals are more healthy, they'll eat more and they might produce more methane. So again, you'll probably have the need for less replacements, and that will reduce your emissions. But really where animal health has a big impact is reducing the carbon footprint. And the issue we have with, some of the things like genetics, animal health, etc., is that as you improve the efficiency of the system and the system becomes more efficient and cheaper to produce, you can end up with rebound effects. And that rebound means you produce more, which then produces more emissions. So that's why we have animal health in the efficiency MACC, but again, animal health is also an enabler for reduced age of finishing. So you can't have one without the other.
They all have an interplay, don't they? This gentleman in row... Oh, you want to come back? Yeah.
No. Yeah. Dermot Power, the RDS. Gary, in scenario 2, there's a 43% reduction in the beef herd. Now, the dairy herd is concentrated in the south and the southeast. That's going to have a huge impact on the beef sector. And remember, all those beef producers are in an area that's farmed environmentally and will have a huge contribution to the carbon footprint going forward.
Yeah, and again, so what I would say there is that is one of our scenarios in terms of, what the lowest activity in terms of beef numbers are. Probably what we would see is that there will be more dairy beef in the system, which will become a larger and larger proportion of the total beef output. If you want to talk about the actual animal numbers and the scenarios, I would pass over to my esteemed colleague, Kevin Hanrahan, who's in the audience, who actually does the FAPRI modelling.
Do you want to come in on that, Kevin? Yeah.
Just to say, hope the mic is...
Yeah, it's on now.
Just to say that the scenarios 2 and 3 we're undertaken to basically illustrate the impact of different policy or different market forces that could arise. We have no perfect foresight about where the price of beef or the price of milk will be between now and 2030. We have a baseline business as usual projection, which we do with our colleagues from the University of Missouri, which is our best assessment of where markets will be and assumes that policy doesn't change between now and 2030. But we know that policy might change, and we know that almost certainly we'll be wrong about where market prices are in 2030. And if we're right, it's purely by chance. But it's important to think about what are the consequences if prices are higher. What are the consequences if prices are lower? What are the consequences if there's some policy change that incentivises more cows, or a policy change that incentivises farmers to hold fewer cows? And that's essentially what scenarios 2 and 3 are doing. The lower activity scenario, I think scenario 2, is about where, for one reason or another, the milk price that dairy farmers respond to is slightly lower than in the base case scenario, and that beef farmers are effectively taxed. There's a negative subsidy in the system that basically changes the incentives those farmers have to farm suckle cows. Is that going to happen? I don't know. but it was a way of exploring the sensitivity of those emissions levels and our capacity to reach those targets as a function of how many animals we have in the system, because that's a critical element of the emissions, both across nitrous oxide and methane together with the fertiliser use, which is what, as Gary outlined earlier, is going to be a critical part of our achievement of the first carbon budget period's targets.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we might come back to animal numbers later as well. Down the back there, yes? Oh, he's going to run down with the mic for you, and I'll come to you now as well.
Yeah, Brian Rush, IFA, and I suppose just coming from a farmer's perspective, just to thank Gary and his team in terms of the work that's gone into this so far. It does provide a clear pathway for the sector, which is a huge benefit. But I suppose the key message I'm hearing here is adoption, 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 and it needs to be wide scale, and it needs to be large scale, and needs to be at pace. And the critical delivery around that is people. And I just think at times we're guilty of overlook it. We're presenting the science, but we're not focusing hard enough of getting to the cohort of farmers who aren't in rooms like these around the country. You have three groups of farmers the way I see it. You have those farmers who will hear about this today, seek out the knowledge and information and adapt. You have a second group of farmers that go to open days, go to discussion groups, they talk among themselves and then they adapt. But then you have a large group of farmers who don't usually engage, who have a peripheral knowledge of it, and they need to be got to. And I suppose, listen, I don't know if the Minister's still here, but for the benefit of the Minister as well, I'd say our sector has shown a laser-like focus on developing a pathway for the sector. We now need to develop a laser-like focus to find the people to deliver on what the MACC is promising us. Okay?
Well, one thing I'll say is in the next panel, there's a talk about Signpost first, and in the next panel we're talking about exactly what you're talking about. That implementation, because that is the key thing in that adoption.
I would recognise the work of the Signpost farms and recognise the critical challenge that are facing our advisory service as well. But it needs to be absolutely laser focused, the same way that we focused on developing the MACC. Just a question I'd have on LULUCF, I suppose, in terms of those diversification measures, in particular anaerobic digestion, that there's a target there of, I think, 120,000 hectares, and then obviously the forestry target of 8,000 hectares. Has there been much consideration given to the availability of that land, or the threat to the availability of land due to changes in government policy? And I'm thinking in particular around the change in government policy around the Nitrates Action Plan, and the challenge from 250 to 220 will have on land use and land availability. Thank you.
Okay, Lillian, do you want to take that on?
Sure, yeah. Certainly in terms of what we put forward in terms of the targets for the forestry, we are all aware that there is certainly huge demand for land, and there's absolutely no question that that's certainly going to be a limitation or a limiting factor in terms of being able to achieve the targets, because of course it's not only the climate targets, we also have biodiversity targets and water quality and everything else we need to deliver from the land. However, what we've put forward is some measures that do require more land. The afforestation does need to be ramped up, certainly, but we also do include that with suites of measures too that relate to management of the existing land areas. And as I mentioned, with that whole LULUCF sector, it's very dynamic and something we would expect to change a lot as we continuously refine our emission factors with respect to those different land use categories. And already we've seen what challenging some of the assumptions and improving and developing new science can alter in the second presentation this morning. So I would expect that there will be quite a lot of change with respect to that. And the other part was the diversification.
I might just come in on that as well. Like, I think that point on the diversification is very well made in relation to the anaerobic digestion. So just to be clear about it, what we're talking about by 2030 in the Climate Action Plan, what we have is a target of 5.7 terawatt hours. If we are to meet that with anaerobic digestion, we need about 150 or 200 of these AD plants across the country. That is a very significant target.
We need about 120,000 hectares of feedstocks, whether it's grass silage. We need to look in the context of the Renewable Energy Directive on how we're going to produce that silage. We have adoption of of clover, multi-species swards for the grass silage component. But I think as well, what is often overlooked is the amount of slurry that we need going into these AD plants if they're going to be co-fed with silage and with slurry. So to reach that 5.7 terawatt hours, we also need 20% of the winter slurry from the cattle in the country to feed those targets. Now, the point about nitrates, look, that has been discussed in the context of the biomethane strategy that's under development at the moment. That's something that all stakeholders are well aware of. There's nothing going to be easy about reaching this 5.7 terawatt hours. There's economic issues that need to be considered, there's environmental issues, and there's social sustainability considerations, and one of them not being more important than any of the others. There's competing policies there in the context of nitrates that will cause us issues. So there's nothing easy about any of the measures here today, but the AD one, we are working on it, and I think the rollout of the biomethane strategy and the renewable heat obligation, which will come on stream, will give us policies in place to provide a demand for the biomethane from these targets.
And there's also what's needed there, I mean, obviously in terms of planning, because we've seen difficulties, is buy-in. Yeah. For rural communities, you know, so that's a massive part of this, and from the farming community who will be growing the feed crops for it, or the feed for it, are using their slurry in it. So there's a big change to happen there, and that buy-in is key. Right down the back there, the gentleman, with the red tie, and then I'll come over here.
Clive Carter, Irish Grain Growers Group. I'd just like to ask, was there any consideration or work done on the use of native grains in feed, like we see feed additives, etc., even in the context of the increase in area for tillage under the land use change? I recently saw some work done by UCD to say that feeding native grains, even at a lower % protein, can have significant reductions on the methane and greenhouse gas emissions from cattle. And I'm just wondering, was there any work done on this? Thanks.
Very interesting.
Suzanne, I might just come in on that. So thanks, Clive, for that question, and I think it's a very pertinent question, and you're aware of the discussions that we're having around the Food Vision Tillage Group, and that's something that's been raised time and time again at that meeting. But just bringing it back to the context of the MACC here today, so where it has been considered is in the diversification measures that we have. So within diversification, one of the subcomponents is increasing that tillage area to the 400,000 hectares that we're aspiring to. Now, we don't go into detail on how we're going to achieve that. That's what the stakeholder grouping that we have, one of them being the Food Vision Group, for us to think about ways that we can increase that tillage area. But the native grain and giving credentials to that is something that's a very live discussion, and I think it's an important one that we need to look into in a little bit more detail. But in the context of the MACC, diversification and expansion of the tillage area is most definitely in there, and the different options about how we achieve it. I suppose that's one of the gaps in the knowledge that we have, and we need to work on that on the research side about looking at ways how we can increase the value added of the tillage sector.
And that piece actually about the methane and the role of perhaps Irish grains in the diet, is the potential there, Gary? Yeah. Have you seen that?
Well, I want to actually end on a positive note with tillage. And one of the good news items is that in terms of our land use inventories, hopefully we'll be refining our cropland inventories, in the not too distant future. So, looking at the impacts of tillage intensity, strong corporation, cover crops on the amount of carbon that can be sequestered. So tillage will probably be the test case, and then we'll move on to grassland after that. But I think tillage will probably spearhead it.
Okay, and methane, reduction, enteric methane, Irish grains?
Again,
It's not.
You know, if you can feed, for example, more oilseed rape, so dietary lipids into the diet, we know that reduces methane quite significantly. The issue there, I think, is that all our oilseed goes to the UK to get processed, and then we'd have to re-import in the spent grain. But again, that provides opportunities.
I might just add into that. So we do have ongoing work within Teagasc where we're looking at the life cycle assessment, say on the beef and the dairy side, about the source of the concentrates, the ingredients that are going into the concentrates. So one take-home message from me from that research really is, depending on where that imported grain is coming from. We all know that we are net importers of concentrates into this country, and whether afforestation is involved in the production of those concentrates. So it depends on where that source is of the concentrates coming into the country, and that changes from year to year.
Yeah. Because I know in the consumer realm, we'll take a mic down to this lady here in the red jacket. You have one. In the consumer realm, I think people mention that a lot.
Yeah.
But why are we importing so much concentrate meal in the bovine sector? Go ahead there.
Laura Burke of the Environmental Protection Agency. Thanks very much, and thanks to Teagasc for all of the work. I must say it's been a really interesting morning. 2 comments and a question. The first comment with regard to diversification, really good to hear all of the work that's happening in that space, because when the EPA produced our projections back in June, we were able to include a lot of the policies and plans from the CAP, but we weren't including the diversification because there wasn't sufficient information there. So hopefully your work will be able to feed into that for coming years. The other comment I'd make with regard to the land drainage, and it's really good to see the research in this space. I suppose just to highlight, because I'd hate anybody to leave here and think, well, that's great, that's the solution to LULUCF. Any changes go right back along the time series back to 1990. So as our knowledge develops, whether that's in agriculture or any other sector, all of those changes go right back. So we're comparing like with like. So although it's very positive to have it, there will still need to be significant changes no matter what in the LULUCF once the sectoral target is agreed. The question I suppose I would have for Gary is, in the context we tend to look at climate or water, ammonia, we tend to look at them individually rather than coming together in certain instances. And I'm conscious that greenhouse gases are a national issue, whereas water quality is very local. And just in the context of the MACC, and this may be too much of an ask, is did you look at both win-wins but also unintended consequences, maybe to kind of follow on from the question earlier, of if you concentrate in one area that may be good for greenhouse gases or not have an impact, but it may have an impact on water quality, for example. Thanks.
And the short answer to that, Laura, is yes. Again, we're very, very conscious that greenhouse gases is only one prism. So, and I will give the specific example of low emission slurry spreading. It looks very expensive from a greenhouse gas prism. It looks like it doesn't deliver a huge amount in terms of greenhouse gas mitigation. But when you look at it in terms of ammonia mitigation, it's very cheap and is very broad. So you do absolutely have to look at particularly nitrogen in the round, because if you're saving nitrogen on the one hand in terms of ammonia, there's more nitrogen in the soil to go up as N2O or to be lost as nitrate. So, and we are actively, I think I can speak for my colleagues, we are looking at doing a water quality MACC at the moment. We will probably update our ammonia MACC in light of what we've done, and yes, so we're always very, very conscious that we don't create one problem by fixing another.
Completely, and I mean in the public discourse about dairy particularly, and those hot areas where water quality was affected the most were of course in the hot dairy production areas. So in terms of a MACC that looks at water quality specifically, I think would convince an awful lot of people that the change is real as well, and that the measures are looking after a number of different interests. You know, I think that's really important for that public buy-in in terms of consumers, but also different rural dwellers who may not be interested in farming or take part in farming, but are concerned about things like water quality. We'll just take one or two more questions before we go to our last presentation and then the next panel, because I don't want to go too much over time. Yes, this gentleman here. Well, there's two here. Yes. No, just in front. Yeah. You were actually the first to put up your hand. Okay. Thanks so much for being patient.
Thanks. Sorry, Frank Connery, Earth Institute, UCD. First of all, congratulations on this work. It's fantastic and has been from the very beginning, and it's crucial for policy design and delivery. Just a question, Gary, about the costing from variable costs to capital costs, kind of a technical question. But I was struck with when Donna said you get an investment in genetics, basically, that lasts. With Bovaer, for example, it's an annual variable cost. And I just wonder how the huge difference in those, and I'm thinking particularly of the Department of Finance, because I know the finance people love investment because they say, okay, we spend X 100 million here, but the problem is more or less fixed, versus an annual cost that's essentially locked in. So I'm just curious, and just for Donna, on the genetics, I looked at the methane emissions per cow over the last 5 or 6 years, and they've gone up slightly, as you probably know. And that tells me as an economist that the signal farmers are getting is not saying that this is a vector that we need to reduce. Your evidence is telling us that there's a terrific opportunity to deliver those two. But at the moment, the trajectory is going slightly in the opposite direction. So it's just to emphasize this huge importance of the genetic interest.
Donny, you might take that breeding question first.
Yeah, can take it very quickly. So if we look at the actual data, the methane emissions per cow for the high genetic merit animals is equivalent to the lower genetic animals. However, the higher genetic animals produce more. So if we look at the EBI, the index, the national index, was introduced in the year 2000. The animals today are 14% more carbon efficient than what they were back in the year 2000. So we have the actual data, the methane data of these animals to compare them.
Okay, Gary, the question about cost.
Yeah, and it's a very good one from Frank. And really, the costing of the measure is quite challenging in many ways because, yes, in terms of the genetics, it's cost negative, and as you change those genetics, the cost saving accrues year on year on year. You've other traditional things such as biomethane that you can MPV, and that's nice and neat to do. And then you've other measures that are a continual annual cost, such as additives. So you end up with a real mishmash of how you're doing those. And don't forget they're marginal costs. So again, you have the cost saving. For example, in the case of our nitrogen measures save on fertilizer. So you have the bizarre case sometimes that the high cost scenario ends up with greater cost savings because you're reducing the inputs by a greater degree. And then on the other hand, you have also higher gas prices, higher electricity prices, and trying to model energy prices. It seems to be an incredibly
good luck with that. Anybody really at the moment. We'll take one last question here from this gentleman, and yes, yourself.
Dave Fitzgerald from Ornua. I have a question in relation to markets, because obviously from a dairy perspective, 90% plus of our dairy is exported. And from a customer perspective, while they're interested in carbon emissions reduction, they're specifically interested in intensity. So the carbon footprint per kilo of milk or cheese that we're selling. Gary, you mentioned now, obviously, you're splitting the MACC curve between absolute and carbon footprint intensity measures. And I think it's going to be important going forward from a market perspective that we can tell the story that intensity is improving at a product level as well. So I just wonder if you could comment on that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see it year in, year out. The carbon footprint of dairy, probably Lawrence can say it better than I can. Year on year is decreasing. The carbon footprint of our beef is decreasing. So absolutely, you have to. I would say you have to keep pedaling with both feet. So you need to reduce the carbon footprint and you need to reduce absolutes. But maybe Lawrence can talk about it.
Okay, we'll talk in our second panel. We'll come back, Lawrence, actually, on that.
Yeah, just comment on that.
Lawrence Liu from Teagasc.
Our carbon footprint today is 0.88 from dairy, so there is a very strong pathway down, and it continues that way. Just to paint a picture of where we see it getting to, you know, based on what Gary talked about, the MACC and the technologies that are out there, we can see it getting to 0.7 in the next, 6-7 years. So there is strong potential to make progress. I suppose the one point, and Gary, you've made it already, is that I suppose the mistake or the issue with the previous MACCs is that we lumped in the efficiency gains, and the only way those efficiency gains were going to be realised was through a cap. So now, by separating them out, we can get both. And all of the total emission reduction measures are also going to give us efficiency gains, is what we want.
Okay. We're going to wrap up this panel. A lot of, well, some of this might come up on our next panel, but first of all, can we please have a round of applause for all the Teagasc experts here involved in the research and doing such wonderful, wonderful work. So now I'm quickly going to introduce Tom Curran, who's taken to the stage there, and he signals kind of the next part of our discussion this morning, which is the Signpost programme implementation on farms. He's going to specifically talk about the Teagasc Advisory Signpost programme, and then we're going to have a panel afterwards to drill a little bit deeper into that and to look at farm take-up and adoption, which is this key metric that this all hangs on. So welcome, Tom.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So just following on from Gary's presentation and the discussion, it's very clear to everybody in the room that adoption is the key thing, and high levels of adoption. So with that in mind, and Frank outlined, a key pillar of the Teagasc Climate Action Strategy is the introduction of a Signpost advisory programme. So just, I suppose, to put it in perspective, we're very grateful for the collaboration that we have with 62 partners in the Signpost programme as it is. We have 120 demonstration farmers right across the spectrum of enterprises distributed out throughout the country. And they're really important, really good quality farmers that are adopting the technologies and using these farmers as, I suppose, a focus for farmers at local level to adopt the technologies further. But to spread that out to the 130 or 40 so farmers that we have in, or 1,000 farmers we have in the country, the Signpost Advisory Programme is critical in that. So I suppose in phase one of this programme, we have 21 high quality people in place as we speak, a really good blend of youth and experience, of people that are focused purely on the adoption of the elements of the MACC that Gary outlined in detail. So what is the focus of this team? It's really to accelerate the adoption. The pathway to that Gary outlined, that the high levels that are required there, this team of people are dedicated to do that. And secondly, was mentioned, new technologies that are currently being researched, and as they come on stream, is to create a capacity for those technologies to be relayed to farmers on an ongoing basis. So I suppose the key thing about the Signpost Advisory Programme is that it's available to all farmers. So all of our customers and clients that we have in common as farmers throughout the country, it's available to everybody. It's about enhanced training and advisory support. So that's really about helping farmers to understand what their carbon footprint is and what they can do on their own farm to impact on that. And that forms the collective situation. So it's about knowing what their number is. That's a key question in a lot of farmers' minds, is what is my carbon footprint and how do I make a plan to do something about it, to reduce it. So we've set ambitious targets of 50,000 farmers to engage in this programme by 2030. And we need to achieve that. And we're working very hard to do that. And that's why we have a dedicated group of advisors in place to help achieve that. Sorry, so I'm jumping ahead there, but George Ramsbottom is going to outline the detail of the programme.
Teagasc has established a new advisory programme to support your farm's climate and sustainability actions. This programme is available to all farmers and it's free of charge. It will provide enhanced advisory and training support to you, helping you select and implement climate and sustainability actions that are tailored for your farm. Participation in the programme will be for 3 years. You will be supported to 1. Establish a baseline assessment of the current actions being implemented on the farm. 2. Determine the total emissions figures for your farm. 3. Develop a tailor-made action plan for your farm. And 4. Make the plan happen through a range of advisory supports which include both group-based and individual follow-up advice. A new team of advisors has just been established within each of the advisory regions to deliver the service. The first thing that you need to do is to register for the free service. Check out the Teagasc website to sign up for this programme today.
Okay, so that's a brief outline of the programme. The second pillar that's key, and it was outlined earlier, is a collaboration between ourselves and Teagasc, ICBF and Board BIA, and that's the development of the AgNav technology. And that's basically the tool that is going to show farmers what their carbon footprint is, and then within that they'll be able to create a plan to implement the measures and show what impact, if they increase the usage of something like protected urea, which was outlined earlier, what impact that has on the carbon footprint. So I have a short video here where Jonathan Hearn, who's centrally involved in developing the programme, will outline and show you the impact that can have.
AgNav is a digital sustainability platform that is centred around farmers and advisors. It compiles data from ICBF Board BIA to create a snapshot of a given farm and uses Teagasc life cycle assessment models to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions of a given farm. What we can see here for this example farm is total greenhouse gas emissions per hectare, and greenhouse gas emissions per kilo output, also known as the carbon footprint. We have also developed a decision support tool that will help the farmer identify mitigation strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, areas in fertiliser, slurry, as well as grazing season. For this example farm, if we reduce fertiliser by 20% and we increase the proportion of nitrogen in the form of protected urea, 90% protected urea, 10% other, we can calculate the impact that has on the greenhouse gas emissions of this example farm. And as we can see, total greenhouse gas emissions reduced by 3.4% and the carbon footprint reduces by 4.2%.
So that's a very brief snapshot of what AgNav can do for the participants in the programme. So currently at the moment, our advisors are busy recruiting farmers. Many farmers have already registered and engaged with the programme. Workshops and discussion group meetings are ongoing as we speak. So I suppose we're targeting farmers maybe with a larger footprint initially, and existing discussion groups. So there's a wide network of discussion groups across dairy, beef and tillage and sheep, and we're targeting farmers in those groups as we speak. I suppose the other thing we're doing is establishing and leveraging our existing relationships with farmers, with farm bodies, and with industry, with whom we have many good working relationships across the industry. And that's going to be really important going forward. Teagasc has a reach, we have a circle of influence, but every single partner and agency that we interact with also have a circle of influence and clients and customers that we need to engage with through this programme. So I suppose I'm going to reiterate this a number of times, but we need to work collaboratively with everybody and with all agencies to get as many farmers through this programme as properly as often as we can. So I've just a short video of one farmer who's going to outline her experience with the programme.
I found out about the Teagasc Signpost Advisory Programme through my local MACC, and I signed up to it because information is knowledge and I need to have my figures and my baseline. As part of the advisory programme, I attended a workshop whereby I provided them with my Board BIA sustainability survey and they provided me back with my current carbon emissions on farm. I'm now able to use that data to reduce my emissions. It's really important for me to know my number so that I can have a plan going forward. I now have a benchmark in place, so as a future farmer, I can ensure that I'm continuing to reduce my emissions on farm.
So just to summarise, we have a target to work towards, and that was very clearly outlined earlier. We've set a target for 50,000 farmers to interact with this programme in the next 7 years. So that's an ambitious target. We have a dedicated team of advisors in place, and what I would say to you about that team is they are, if you like, a resource that each of you can interact with, and we'd encourage you to interact with at local level to utilise that resource. We have the technologies that will reduce greenhouse gases initially, and more will come on stream as the research takes place and those technologies become usable by farmers. So that's really important. I suppose my challenge to you is to interact with us and interact with our team of advisors to utilise that resource so that we can reach as many farmers as possible over the next 7 years. So thank you for your time.
Tom, that collaborative approach with agencies is key, with farm unions, with rural populations, discussion groups, obviously. They're the lads and lassies that are engaged in what's going on in their farm and want to hear other people's experiences and want to learn the science. But as Brian mentioned, there are kind of Venn diagrams of people maybe a little bit outside that, and they're going to be the challenge. How do we reach them in terms of reducing our targets and getting there? So this panel is going to be about that now. We're going to discuss that adoption further. And I'd like to welcome to this stage Professor Frank O'Mara, the Director of Teagasc, Edwina Love, who's the Principal Officer in Climate Change and Bioenergy at the Department of Agriculture, Thomas Duffy, who's a farmer and chair of Teagasc Signpost programme, and Deirdre Ryan, the Director of Origin Green. So welcome. Frank, Signpost, how long has it been in operation? How are you feeling it's going? Will we get there?
Will we get there? Really good question. So look, I suppose the basic part of the Signpost programme, the establishment of the demonstration farm network, and this is key. That's about 2 years old. I think we initially started selecting those farms about 2 years ago, and with 62 partners, which is brilliant, right across the industry, dairy, meat, other sectors, all involved in that. Now we have 120 odd demonstration farms where other farmers can go and see the technologies, hear from a farmer, look, I tried this, it actually worked, or I tried this and it didn't work, and so I adapted. So that's the function of those demonstration farms. What we've added onto it now is the ability to work then on a one-to-one level with farmers, because it's great farmers go to an open day on one of these demonstration farms, but when they come home, the brochure is up on the dashboard of the Jeep or whatever, and it stays there until 6 months later it's gone curly and it's thrown out.
Yes.
So you need a bit of follow-up, and I suppose that's where we're at here, where we want to get those farmers now and work with them so that on their particular farm, look, this is your emission profile. Eventually we'll be able to tell them this is what you're sequestering as well. But at the moment it's just the emissions. This is your emissions. If you do these things, and you saw the little slider there, if you reduce your fertiliser by 10% or 20%, or you switch to protected urea, this is what it'll do in your farm. So the farmer hopefully creates a plan for his or her farm. We want it to be the farmer's plan, not the Teagasc plan, the farmer's plan, that they say, yeah, God, I probably could reduce fertiliser by 20% or whatever. So they go away with 4 or 5 actions to do over the next 3 years, and we'll support them then. We'll check in with them. How's that going? Do you remember you talked about putting in clover? Do you want a bit of help with that? There's a farm walk on in your locality next week on clover. Might be a good place to go. So we've added that capability now to work with individual farms. I would say, with 21 new advisors, that's not going to be enough. We're going to need to add more resources into that programme over the coming years, and we hope to do that. And it is going to take, all the other players in the industry that Tom mentioned, all the other influencers kind of also, encouraging farmers along the same way. And the last point I'd want to make is, I think we have to stop telling farmers, you have to do this.
I know.
I think farmers, and by and large, I think they do want to do things. They do want to own this problem and solve it. And we have to. Our view is we have to help empower them to do things rather than tell them what they have to do. And that's the philosophy, I suppose, that we're adopting in this programme of working with farmers rather than talking at them.
Yeah, because I think they feel there's an awful lot they're being told to do. Deirdre, in terms of Origin Green, that international marketplace, I know that the speaker there from Ornu was mentioning the same thing. There is a perception that we are green, that we have a great climate pedigree on our grassland base, mainly in terms of our food production and dairy, particularly, which other countries really don't have. But that demand for more climate, tick boxes is going to go up and up and up from retailers and from international marketplaces, that where the baseline is now might get even difficult and more difficult to achieve those credentials. So you in turn are passing to Origin Green that onto manufacturers, but also down to farmers. You're saying you need to do more. Is that going to be a difficult message as this goes on? Because they're already very compliant with regulations. We know they get an awful lot of farm inspections. We know the regulatory compliance is brilliant here. But how do you push that, like Frank says, without making it a have-to-do thing?
Yeah, so certainly it was mentioned earlier, we export 90% of what we produce to about 180 countries. So it's all built on our reputation of sustainably produced food, and it is recognised internationally, the strides that have been made and the efforts that have been made and our natural advantages. And we would do a lot of research on our buyers internationally, and 83% say, they recognise Ireland as a source of sustainable food. They know where we are, they know what we do. But the demands are certainly increasing, and there's a lot of international customers making net zero targets and at times not really knowing themselves how to achieve it, and coming to us and coming to their manufacturers here in Ireland to kind of help them and support them and to achieve that. So there's a number of ways, and I think it's just wonderful, I think today, just the developments in the MACC, and to have that roadmap and to be able to share the information and the research that's coming down the line. So I think we're seeing two big things with customers coming to Ireland. We've numerous visits every week coming over from inward buy visits. Is the buying teams are getting closer to the sustainability teams, and their KPIs are getting more and more tied to sustainability, which is creating that kind of market signals. But also, the interest in the science and where it's going and the roadmap. And so I suppose we work very closely now with a lot of the sharing the science, and having the MACC today is going to be, brilliant to have and to share those plans. But it is a challenge, and I think, the approach that Frank mentioned is very much, between the big pieces of work we're working on now is the primary producer standards, the assurance programs, but also AgNav being a huge piece of work that we're working on in Origin Green with Teagasc and with ICBF, and huge efforts have been made and progress since we were last here at the launch of the climate strategy for Teagasc. Yeah. So the approach is very much around, the individual farmer choosing those actions through AgNav. So, it is something we would like to have in the primary producer standard, that every farm has an action plan, but that action plan has to be decided by farmers. But certainly within the standards that we have, there are the criteria that are non-compliance criteria that, need to be there for an insurance perspective. But the approach, certainly from the action plan perspective, is around deciding those plans that's specific and going to have an impact, and using the tools through AgNav to make that action plan.
Okay. I'm going to come to you, Thomas, in a second. I just want to go to Edwina first about the climate action plan. When the reductions were decided upon, that 25% for agriculture, does the department feel things have to move faster? There's a narrower window of opportunity as each year goes by. The later we start on the big actions, the more we have to do, because we're already really a laggard in Europe, where we're 10, 20 years behind some countries, and it makes the hill higher to climb. Is there an energy there that we're into a different phase of this now?
Well, I think our system of agriculture is very different in Europe, and I suppose we have to acknowledge that. We do have a particular challenge with our agriculture emissions because of the historical legacy issues around our peaty soils, etc. I suppose what we have seen is the research and how that has influenced through. So the 2018 MACC was absolutely a strong guide for the climate action plans pre-2023, and also influenced our acclimatised document. There's been a lot of discussion today about the need for collaboration, and what we saw in acclimatised was bringing together the various stakeholders through industry, through research, and then the department and the levers that we have. Certainly the 25% target is extraordinarily challenging, and I think from a department's perspective, we're looking at the range of tools that we have to deploy that. I mean, today's developments will provide that guide, and it's very clear from the work that Gary and the team have done in terms of the decisions that need to be taken, how quickly can we roll these things out, but critically, what are the appropriate tools to do that? So from our perspective, it's about is it incentive? Is it regulation? And trying to figure out what the best way to move forward is. So in terms of incentives, we obviously have the Common Agricultural Policy that's already working, and we've seen significant investment through eco schemes, through acres. We have investment in organics, and the new forestry programme, when it becomes available, will also provide strong support for these moves. From a regulatory perspective, the nitrates has been mentioned. That is a tool that can be used. We also have the new fertiliser database that will come on stream later this year. And I think it is important from the department's perspective that we work on the enabling action. So it was mentioned earlier the investment that we make in research and the work that we do alongside Teagasc in terms of supporting a lot of the information that we need to deploy the science into practice. But also the strategies, and these were touched on previously by Fiona in the last session. I mean, we're working with the tillage sector on a tillage strategy. We are working on a biomethane strategy. We're aware that these are very difficult things to deal with, and we're trying to listen and engage across government, across stakeholders, with farmers to understand where the blockages are and how do we navigate those together.
Okay. We will come back to some of the points you raised there. Thomas, at farm level, what are you hearing? What are you doing first on your farm? Enlighten us.
Basically, I use the 2018 MACC like a menu. I joke with Tom O'Dwyer that I've gotten to the end, so what's the next now? We've switched to 100% sex semen protected urea, obviously. No, we didn't go with the 10-10-20, 18-6-12 approach. Instead, we went with straights, P&K, balance those. We've used our nutrient management plan to reduce or to improve our pH across all the soils. We have to be a little bit careful. Again, this kind of shows the difficulty that some farmers can have because we are high molybdenum soil, so we could have potential risk with copper lockup, but we've worked with our advisors on that. The entire farm has clover on it at this stage, and this year we took a very possibly foolish, possibly brave decision to essentially not spread any fertiliser on about 60% of the grazing platform to try and encourage more and more of the clover to come up. There's about 40% left, which we are overseeding with clover, but we have some weed pressures that we need to address first. This is part of the challenge, particularly multi-species and also with clover, where you have a weed pressure, you need to address that first. You need a long-term strategy for that. So there are a lot of complexities in terms of practical applications. Our EBI is constantly improving, as I say, and we're able to select the best of our herd. We select about the top 30% because we just need to maintain, we're in around 100 cows. We've made a move towards robotic milking to get more data on our cows now individually to select out, again, more efficient cows. So that's what I'm doing.
You're kind of winning at this. Are you the poster boy?
No, because there are a lot of other farmers that are able to spend a lot more time and probably do it better on their farm in terms of production.
Is that a key thing, though, that I mean, because that's what I hear with mixed species swords, and I tried it, it's not for me, or this didn't work, or every person's soil and land is different as well. The time they have to dedicate to it is different. The mixes they might buy, the products they might buy are difficult, so are different. So is it a matter of persistence and chatting amongst people and saying what worked for you, what worked for me?
Yeah, and I mean, there are, if we just take multi-species, because I think that's a great emerging technology. It's not the technology that should be recommended for the vast majority of farmers yet. That's clover. Clover is the key. Let's get that managed first. Let's get the nitrogen down. Then we can talk about multi-species. But there are farmers, I mean, I know some incredibly large, incredibly progressive farmers in Meath, for instance, who have switched to about 70% of, I think 60-70% of theirs are now multi-species swords. So I'm talking to them going, okay, well, how did you manage the weed pressure? We do have regulatory challenges as well. For instance, there are very few products which are chicory safe. Unfortunately, none of them are licensed in the EU because they've never been sought. That's not that the EU blocks them. It's just that no one has submitted the safety data for that. We nearly lost 2,4-DB, which would have been a massive impact on the ability to sow and overseed clover because we need that to control docks. So there are a number of different complexity, a number of different barriers you can get over it. I've moved towards a different method we're trialling this year of a two-spray method as such, not using a post-emergent spray, but using a pre-emergent spray. The downside is that leaves me without a field for an extra 4 weeks.
Right.
So those are practical challenges. Again, this is developing farmers. There are, as we said, there are probably 3 cohorts of farmers. Those early adopters, the guys like maybe like me, who are trying things and figuring things out. who can then maybe feed into the research and feed into the shared practical experience. But they will have downsides. I mean, one of my multi-species failed entirely.
Yes.
It's not going to stop me using it the next time. But I will select it on the driest parts of my farm because that's where I have the drought pressure, and that's where it would make the most return for me.
Yeah. It's and that nuances everything, isn't it? You can't paint this as easy, Frank. If you adopt all of them, can you? Measures will really work on some farms and they just won't on others.
That's right. And look, everyone's circumstances are different, and every, people's interest and ability and everything, lots of different. So, there isn't a kind of a one size fits all. And that's why, we want to work at an individual level with farms and at a particular point in time, what's right for them. So that's the idea, I suppose, of the Signpost Advisory Programme. But look, I think there's a lot happening already, on the ground. If you think back to the complicated diagrams we had of the MACC, dairy EBI, huge, like that's a technology farmers have been adopting for many, many years. What's new now, and maybe it didn't come across quite clear, is we're now saying that's contributing to absolute reduction in emissions, not just efficiency, but that's something that's kind of in the bag already. Farmers are doing it. The nitrogen reduction side of it, and Gary outlined, that's where we've really got to focus on now, because that's where we can, we have the
make
technologies
now.
Yeah. Like last year, farmers reduced nitrogen fertiliser by, I think, 14%. Now, I know a lot of that was price driven and that, but and we think that has followed over into this year. But I would also like to think it's at least partly due to the fact that there's a lot more clover being established in our swards. Farmers are now using the low emission slurry spreading at a very wide level, which does allow you to save nitrogen, and we've seen a big increase in interest in liming. So there's great progress being made on those things. Protected urea, from a kind of a standing start of this is a new technology, people never heard of it, So I think in 2021 we were somewhere around in 2022, we were somewhere around 9 or 10% of the total nitrogen was in the form of protected urea. The indications are that that's gone up again this year. Obviously, we have to get to nearly 100% by the end of the decade, so a lot go. But look, we're on the right trajectory. And the last one, just to mention, which again is a new thing in the MACC here, the emphasis we have on age at finish of beef cattle. And look, this isn't something that we have to start now. The average age of finishing has been reducing by a week per year. It's a bit like life expectancy going up by a month, a year, or whatever.
As we get older, the cattle get younger.
Exactly, yeah. So life expectancy of our cattle, unfortunately, for them isn't increasing. It's gone down by about a week a year. So we just need to continue that trend and accelerate it a little bit. So there's a lot happening already in terms of being rightly positioned or properly positioned to deliver on the measures in the MACC. Yes, there's some of them off out towards the end of the decade, the feed additives and so on. We have to come to those, and the research has to be fine-tuned on those. But there's an awful lot we can do now, and I think it's really encouraging, the trajectory that we're on with some of those measures.
Edwina, if you're talking about, farmers like carrot more than stick, I mean, who doesn't? Incentivising stuff, if you look at the less technology, the slurry spreading, the TAMS, the inclusion of that on TAMS and 60% grant aid has really accelerated the adoption of that technology, and it has quite a big impact. Is there an acknowledgement, and I mean, of course there is, but I suppose what people are hungry to hear is we will get more help. We will get more payments to do this stuff. We will get more, maybe reduction in the cost of sex semen, maybe in terms of additives when they come on stream, that will be subsidised by the department. Is there acknowledgement of that?
I think where we're at from the department's perspective is that we need to find sustainable long-term solutions. So the support that's provided for less now, absolutely. If we were to ban splash plate, we wouldn't be able to provide that support. So that's the way it works. So I think for us, we're looking at things like carbon farming and the work that's ongoing now that was outlined earlier in relation to AgNav as a platform for that. And that's actually a really good example in terms of the mix between incentive, regulation and cooperation, I think, with industry. Because within carbon farming, obviously there is a financial requirement, a financial incentive piece. So there'll be pilots, there'll be funding provided, public funding for pilots to get things up and running. There's also the matter of where does private industry come in and start paying for this? You know what I mean? I'm able to reduce emissions on my farm by X amount, so therefore do I attract a sustainability bonus, or is somebody willing to pay for that, from a philanthropic perspective? The department's role on the regulatory side, we need to provide an enabling framework for carbon farming to work, and we're working. There's a piece of work underway in relation to that, and the Commission are also developing a regulation regarding carbon removals, which will also guide all of this. So I think that's the kind of model we need to work to. There isn't going to be one solution for all of it. Even if we wanted to, we couldn't pay for everything. You know, we need to find sustainable long-term solutions for it. And there will be a role for CAP in it, there will be a role for industry, and particularly on the cost-effective measures, or the kind of the ones that have been identified in the MACC, where it's actually financially beneficial for farmers to undertake these activities. It's the communication around that and making it easy for them to switch practices.
Thomas, what are you hearing that farmers want more of? Like, I do this if only it were blank, you know, or what?
The first thing they want is clarity. I think one of the biggest challenges we have, like we talked about the 3 groups, let's say, but unfortunately there's a growing 4th group, which are people who maybe adopted things and were burnt by them, or they adopted things and they feel that they are not being recognised for that.
Right.
And like we get the complexity with the inventory that's unavoidable. We need good science. I mean, the example today with the Peat, that's a perfect example. The entire farming community should be able to look at that and go, this is a great example of where research is really yielding the truth. We're not talking about skewing anything. We're not talking about false science or bad science. We're talking about the truth, which is more accurate and better. So there is a feeling of frustration. We need to make sure that, I would say, above all, we need to make sure that the voices which farmers are hearing the loudest are actually scientists. They're actual researchers in these areas. They're actual agricultural greenhouse gas emission scientists.
Okay.
And people in that space.
Well, what's happening now? What are the loudest voices now?
Very often better maybe media performers. That's unavoidable. You'll have some very good speakers. Some people who maybe have genuine concerns about the model of farming, but are maybe exaggerating what their concerns are to a certain extent. And then some people who are unfortunately maybe motivated by other reasons that are not supportive of the farming community. Now, personally, I have no problem with criticism of the farming community, and actually in terms of what I think farmers need, and this is maybe a bit of a dangerous one, but I'm no longer a farm leader, so I can get away with more. Yes, they absolutely need incentives. I believe things like sex semen should be incentivized. Look, protected urea is an example of a technology which exists today, so I think there has to be an industry push now. When you walk into the yard, you shouldn't see a bag of can anymore. That's the long and the short of it. It shouldn't be there. Urea may have a place for a little while yet, but protected urea should be in every single yard, and that's what should be pushed. There are processors and every industry player that needs to be pushing that. But so that really needs to be off the market. And there are even some farmers, which this will maybe surprise some people, there are some farmers who actually support banning can now at this stage. Those extremely progressive farmers, because they say, well, why do we need it anymore? But we do need investments. And we also need to consider the wider community, right? Like, yes, there are some technologies that will be very specific to a given area. There are some that will have costs. But like we talked about changing hedgerow practice, that is entirely a social. That is how do we change the cultural attitude towards that, so that it is no longer socially acceptable to have these terribly, as I call them, badly cut, other farmers we might say good, but shortcut
boxed off hedges.
Terrible.
Yeah.
But
beautifully neat, but not,
and there's an education.
Not great at anything else.
Years ago, I had the joy of doing a training course with my father, giving a training course to my father.
That must have been
fun. It was quite fun. That and 2 of my uncles. And these were men who had farmed their entire lives. They had never heard that when you cut a hedge in a single year, it doesn't flower that year. And so it's virtually useless for biodiversity. They're not bad people. No one ever said that to them. So there is an education there as well. But I think sometimes we maybe put too much of an emphasis on. It's great to hear talk about a sustainability bonus, because that is where I think the processors need to be moving as well.
Okay. Is that likely to happen, Frank?
Well, yes, it is happening. Some of the co-ops already have sustainability bonus schemes in place, and I know lots of other industry players are thinking how they can support farmers through the pricing mechanisms, whether it's for milk or indeed for meat. And I always think, look, there's 3 influencers on farmers here. There's the people who buy their products, the milk processors, the meat producers, the grain buyers. There's the regulator through either regulation or through the Common Agricultural Policy and the incentives that can be brought about through that. And then there's the likes of us, knowledge providers, whether you're Teagasc or private consultants or universities or whatever. There's the advice message. But the advice message, if you don't have the other bits in place, has hard work to do. The other, there's no point bringing in a regulation without having an advisory system to support farmers in changing or so on. So you need all those three pillars of the marketplace, the purchasers, the regulators and the advisors all working together. Yeah.
Okay. We're going to take some questions. Does anyone want to put up their hand? They're all being shy now. Or maybe they're totally satisfied with everything that's been said. Gentleman here in the blue shirt. We're going to have great buy-in at this rate. Huge adoption rates. No problems.
No problems. First of all, Kieran Holden is my name. I'm with Origin Enterprises. Just want to congratulate all the speakers and the presenters. Just in terms of soil fertility, so we're talking a lot about nitrogen. Frank mentioned that nitrogen use down 14% last year. P&K use is down 25 to 30% last year. I was down in the Dairy Day in Moore Park last week. 20% of soils are in optimum fertility. We will not get clover persistency with poor soil fertility. We have poor nutrient use efficiency, nitrogen use efficiency, and Gary mentioned earlier about nitrous oxide emissions being lower on higher fertility soils versus lower fertility soils. So just when we're talking about incentivising nitrogen and incentives, we see from the lime subsidy this year that there's been a 4.5 times increase in terms of volumes of lime applied for versus what's usually applied. Is there something we can do from a P&K point of view? Because over the last 20, 30 years, from an advisory point of view, it's the same message going out, but it's not landing on farm. So what can we do to increase soil fertility? Because it seems to play into nitrous oxide emissions, it plays into reducing nitrogen as well.
Who'd like to address that, Frank?
Yeah, look, it's a really important point. And when we talk about reduced fertiliser use, we're very careful, Lisa. I always hope I am anyway to say it's reduced nitrogen fertiliser use we want, because we do need to maintain soil fertility in with regard to P&K and pH. Now, we don't want to overdo it either. It's appropriate use of those fertilisers, because P in particular kind of impact on water quality. So look, we're for us, we're one of the things, I suppose, the Teagasc and its predecessors, ACOT and AFT, were set up on was about soil fertility. It's an old message, but it's still really, really important. And I suppose, there has been a lot of emphasis on it. You're right in terms of a lot of our soils don't reach the targets. Sometimes maybe we don't present that well enough, because for some of our low intensity grasslands, like, an index 3 P or K is not appropriate for those. So, but for the intensively farmed soils, yes, there's not enough of them at the level of P and K index that we would like, and it is something we have to continue to work on and focus on. And I think last year with the price of fertiliser, as you say, nitrogen down 14%, P and K down even more. Farmers took a bit of a holiday from their P and K, and they said, I'll rely on my soil fertility from that had built up over previous years. But that's a practice that you can't continue. If you run down your P and K, you just get into all sorts of bother. And the measures that we talk about, the clover and so on, as you say, they just won't work. So really important that we do keep a focus on building soil fertility where that's appropriate.
And on particular inputs. Okay. Yes, lady.
Just on that as well. No, it's me.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, just on that. I mean, one of the things, like P&K doesn't just come in a bag, but for a lot of farmers we have this issue. I mean, again, I come from Cavan. We have an awful lot of pigs and poultry in that part of the world. Like there are definitely ways farmers can utilise their P&K better and target it better. And I think we do need to. This is one thing that we see. I've seen a lot more on the continent. Support for investments to actually move some of that, because again, slurry is 90% water. If we can reduce that down, it becomes more viable to transport it over higher distances, and it'd be a lot more valuable to farmers.
Okay, good point. Lady here in the aisle seat.
Yes, Anne Randalls from Ornua. Just want to, first of all, just congratulate Frank and the team from a really, really impressive session this morning, and the work that's going on there is really encouraging. And also the panels as well. The panels have been great. I have a particular question for Thomas, because I've been really struck with his knowledge, his actions, what he has done to date in terms of the previous MACC curve. Hopefully, we have a new version for you now that will drive other measures for you. And I would be interested to know, like, what do you think of that? But the second question is, you did list a significant number of measures that you've taken on farm. What you didn't say was what the impact that has been on your farm in terms of your carbon footprint and carbon emissions, maybe total and carbon intensity. I'd be really interested to know a bit more about that. Thank you.
I actually have my Board B inspection tomorrow, so I'll be able to tell you exactly then. The last time we looked at it, we were about 0.82, but that was before we adopted some of and more of the updates in AgNav. So it'd be really interesting to see exactly what impact they have. Some of them have been a long-running thing. EBI, in particular, has been a focus for me. We started adopting sex semen 4 years ago. We have a crossbred. Some of our herd are crossbred, so we adopted that purely for the jerseys, because, as my father was very clear, he didn't want to see a Jersey bull around the place. So we've avoided that for the entire 3 years. And then we adopted it when the better sires became available in the Holsteins and the Norwegians that we also use. So those ones should have had an impact. In terms of the new MACC curve, I mean, if someone wants to come and build an anaerobic digestion plant on my farm, I'm very happy to host it. I do think there are a lot of really innovative, and I think the move from AD, like anaerobic digestion, maybe for combined heat and power, towards biomethane. We have a very large transport company, Virginia Transport, beside us. They had invested, I think, 50% of their trucks were gas powered. So there is a potential here to create, and I think we've covered a lot of different factors in this, but maybe one factor which often gets left out in the discussion around is actually local authorities and what incentives they could potentially provide, what are local strategies around environmental, because that's ultimately where farmers live and the communities that they live in. So there has to be a potential here, and there are different regions in the country. The border Midlands and West is very different from the Southeast. Yeah. The pressures are very different. Yeah. But we have a longer housing period, so that means potentially biomethane should be more located in our areas and generate a lot more work on that.
Yeah. You know, those regional differences are important to remember. Was there another person over this way? Yes. We'll get a mic. Just a gentleman down there and about. Yeah, he's sticking up his hand.
Thank you. It's David Kennedy, Head of Dairy at Board B. I'd just like to emphasise the market element that Dave Fitzgerald brought up earlier and Deirdre spoke on. When these international buyers come in and they ask us about Ireland's production systems, they're immediately impressed by what's happening through the existing MACC and the data that it gives and how it's measured in the sustainable assurance schemes. But then they tell us we're ahead of the curve, but they tell us that others are catching up. So I really commend the work done by Teagasc in driving this agenda forward, and the work done by the farm orgs in sending it out there at farm level. And I suppose I'm asking for us to continue as an industry to look for those incremental improvements as we go on. Because although we're at the forefront, the world is quick trying to catch up, and our competitive advantage should be maintained. And that's just my point. So thanks very much to everyone from Teagasc.
Talking about that wider view, we have in the audience Sue McCluskey, and she's a special representative on agriculture. We might get a mic over to Sue. And I'd just like to hear your view on this, Sue, being here today. You know, you've obviously very difficult climate and landscape to us, but a lot of the challenges, of course, around food production and climate are the same anywhere in the world. So what are you hearing today?
So thank you very much. First of all, congratulations. I think it's a terrific plan. So well done to putting this together. I think that there are a number of observations that I'll make that have really jumped out at me. The first, and we've heard it from a number of people, there's no one size fits all, there's no silver bullet, there's no single solution. The way we farm in Australia is very different to here. You know, a lot of my questions I'll follow up afterwards, but I'm not sure I know what a hedgerow is. I thought I knew what it was. I thought they were what you had in gardens, not on farms. We have water challenges, but our water is not around drainage. It's around getting hold water. Of us. Yeah. Getting water. So, you know, we think about water management, dams, water storage, water collection, that sort of thing. I've been really fascinated. I'm a beef cattle farmer myself at the time to slaughter, because I've kept hearing this. Our time to slaughter for domestic is about half of yours. We're about 14 to 15 months. And so, you know, and I've been trying to think about why. Partly, I think it is because we are drier. Because, of course, for you know, anyone that breeds cattle, you know, if they eat green feed all day, it sort of goes in one end and out the other. So we have the ability to actually perhaps finish better on farm. But we also, I think, have used genetics very much to look at more early maturing cattle and really focus on carcass, length and depth. We do have a similar equivalent, but I don't think focus on sustainability. You've got EBIs, we've got EBVs, which is more around milking ability, fertility, weight gain, that sort of thing. So I think that was the first thing I wanted to note. The second one, I'm really keen to learn more about your baseline, because that's something that in Australia we're keen now to look at, and part of the reason I'm here in Ireland is to learn what you're doing here, how you're measuring it, because it's really important for farmers to know where they're at now, and then what are the actions they do that can make a difference. Does it add to it? Does it take away? But that takes me to probably the one that I'm really grappling with, and I haven't heard anyone mention, perhaps touch slightly on it. I've heard farmers in the audience on the screen and on the panel talk about knowing your number. This has been really good in terms of reducing your carbon footprint, reducing your emissions. What I'm trying to get my head around is what is the value proposition for the farmer? Because one of the things I'm looking to take back is what's in it for a farmer that's going to make them want to do this. And it's not just about because it's good. I don't think I'm going to be able to sell that to our farmers. We very much focus on productivity, efficiency and profitability. So if it's going to reduce the cost of our inputs, if it's going to give us a premium, if it's actually going to increase the margin we get, that would make a big difference. We don't have subsidies directly, apart from in certain exceptional circumstances. We don't have a cap on alternative. So from a government policy perspective, there are limited actions you can do to provide incentives. And then also a little bit different, I think I'm seeing here in Ireland, and also I was seeing in New Zealand, is you're such a large exporter that market access is a key driver. For us, it is part of the driver, but then how do you tell domestic producers that competitiveness is really important? So I'm really keen to learn more about that. And I think finally, I think there's a lot we could share. I'd be really keen to see if there's opportunities for Australia to work more closely with you. We have a research and development model that goes across the 15 different industry sectors. I admire the way that you can be Team Ireland, because we are a bit challenged on that. We do great individually in the sectors, but not perhaps as Team Australia. We've lived a long time on our clean and green. But like we just heard, there's others that are getting ahead of us now. So we've got to really stay up there and learn what we can. But any opportunities, that, particularly around, say, methane, I think there could be work that we could do together. So they're my observations, and I'd be happy to follow up with others with some of the questions.
Very good. Thank you, Sue. Thanks for your contribution. I learned a lot there. Frank, to answer that essential question, is it just goodwill? Where is the motivation at the end of the day?
Look, a really good question and a really good observation. Maybe Thomas might have views on it as well, and indeed the other panellists. But look, the first thing I would say, if you cast your mind back to the MACC and all the little blocks along the line of it, about the first 60% of those were below the line. They're measures that, as farmers adopt them, they'll also improve profitability or the bottom line. So there's kind of win-wins there. And they're the ones that we're focusing on very strongly now in this initial phase. The ones that cost money, yes, there is a challenge there. Number one, can we reduce the cost with more research over time? But if we can't, like, who's going to pay, I guess, or how is that going to be dealt with? And I suppose, Deirdre, you probably would say, and I totally agree, that, part of this is, it's your calling card as an industry, that we get these emissions under control. So there's that value proposition that the industry, I suppose, needs to deal with these issues. That's at a collective. when you come down to an individual farm level, that's harder to drill that down and convince individuals.
Yeah.
But look, I think that the country as a whole, we do recognise that reaching our climate targets is going to cost money. There's a huge amount of investment going into the electricity sector, the transport sector, the residential sector to incentivise people to make change. Now, a lot of that is, as Frank Convery said, is kind of the capital side, and governments much prefer investing in capital rather than in ongoing things, and some of the things we're talking about are ongoing. And they're the challenges, look, we're going to have to figure out over the next few years. How are we going to get in a position that farmers will see that as something that, yes, I must do.
Yeah, and adopt these measures.
Yeah.
Deirdre?
Yeah, just to build on what Frank said, and there is, I think the one thing today is there's no silver bullet in terms of how we approach this. There's policy elements, policy incentives, there's processors that are, going to be incentivising, there's the marketplace, and I think just the guidance and support, and we hear that all the time in our farmer research, just wanting clear, concise communication and information, and the advisory is essential in that, and hopefully the knowing your number and making a plan and collaboration there. But I think when we talk about the marketplace as well, I think that message around we're trying to get the best channels, we're trying to get the best into the best markets and best market access, and bring that message back to the farming community here about it's best markets, best channels, and best customers that are coming in. So all the time trying to share that message from the marketplace. And I think as well, to the other question around how do we calculate and how do we get the numbers, probably an element of that answers the first piece as well, is we do have a tight-knit industry and infrastructure here, and even having the ability to make the calculation on farm level for the carbon footprint is a collaborative effort. It's information collected on your Board via farm audit, combined with the database that the Irish Cattle Breeding Federation, based on the models that Teagasc have developed over years and the IP available there, kind of coming together, and even the connection of respective databases. So that's all kind of coming together in the platform that we have in AgNav. So I think that infrastructure has really been essential for us, and will be, into the future, and leaning more and more into it, and that collaborative piece, so that those messages are translated down to farm level.
Okay. Any more? One or two questions, and then we're going to finish up. Gentleman here, yeah, and here.
Yeah, as a farmer still learning my trade for the last 52 years, I'm hugely impressed with the panel and what we're hearing today. But the one common denominator in all my time farming has been this challenge of adoption. It is an enormous challenge. We never had as many tools as we have now available, and really wonderful initiatives, but equally we were never as confused. As I talk to farmers today, they don't know whether it's regulation or climate, or they're a bit bamboozled. So I suggest we need to simplify the message, to, if we can at all, use common language. There's a lot of different terms used for different things, and people are confused. And probably the one thing that motivates more than anything else is, will this make me more money? And I think we could up our game a bit more on that thing about that. If we adopt, as Thomas has done, this is the benefit. The benefit comes in my bottom line by improving. And I think we need to up our game on that to quite a degree. And I think that's probably the biggest thing of all that I suggest we should concentrate on, and overlay that over all this excellent work.
Like Thomas, you were talking about your carbon score going down, but has your profitability gone up? Can you shout this and say, it works for me this way,
I've never sat down and done it.
Right.
I probably should at some stage. There are definitely things that have. I mean, there's no question the improvement in the ABI has. And I'm only really being able to verify that now since we invested in the robot. Milk recording is great, but it's a snapshot. Whereas, like, say, for instance, this year, we started with roughly 100 cows. I've culled out 7 of them. Now, it just so happens they're all low EBI. But they were also the poor performers. They were eating as much, they were producing as much methane as the other ones. So there are, sometimes you need special verification. Protected urea has no question made it cheaper. The reduction in my fertiliser made it cheaper for me to produce. Now, the one thing I would say, and this goes to that very question, right? So there are some things that are cost neutral, and we also haven't really talked about risk neutral. So improving EBI is risk neutral. Sex semen is not risk neutral, but it is cost neutral for the most part. You have to take a leap of faith that you're not going to have too many. I ended up with 26 heifers. I only need 21 the first 2 years I did it because I overdid it. But my calving pattern also spread out a little bit too much. So I needed to pull back and use beef AI a little bit quicker. I needed to pull my breeding went from about 6 weeks to back down to 4 weeks. Every heifer is now calved in 4 months. The bull goes out a bit quicker. That's a nervous thing. And that's where, in my opinion, regulatory and supports need to be there to help farmers overcome the risk aspect. When you pull back on nitrogen for the first time, risk, your grass is going to plummet, you are going to have more of a challenge. Again, there needs to be supports there. We need to be very clear, though, I think there's a more broad conversation we need to have about the agricultural sector. What are schemes for? Are they there to support sectors to exist? Or are they there, and this is my opinion, I believe the market, including the processors, but also the suppliers, should be there for the things that the market will pay for. And we know that the buyers will give us access to markets. I mean, I sat down only recently with the head of sustainability in Danone. They're talking about a 30% methane reduction. Now, that's for fresh milk, it's not for us, but that will come down the line for us too. That's a reality farmers need to be aware of. But from a regulatory point of view, those have to be about supporting the things that the market does not return. And the market does not return clean water. The market does not return low greenhouse gas emissions. The market does not return biodiversity. So that is where the schemes need to be very clearly rewarding us for. And then after that, we need to be removing the bad behaviour from the minority. And I stress this is an incredible minority.
I agree, yeah.
And more often it's confusion. So again, in terms of improving soil fertility, farmers going out at the wrong time, not getting the message right, and that is both dry and wet. We focus a lot in Ireland on the wet, but equally we just had a drought period of about 4 weeks. No nitrogen really should have been spread on dry soils on that. Slurry maybe should have been held for... I mean, slurry isn't going anywhere. Guys get really excited about getting slurry out. They think I'm mad because I leave it in there for another 2 weeks. But sure, it was too dry to spread it. And I spread it when the rain came and when the uptake was going to be good on the P and K and the N. Not the end of the world.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, we'll take literally one more question, then we'll go to you, Frank, for a wrap-up.
PJ Burke from EasyFix down in Galway. Again, I'd like to commend certainly Gary Lenigan on producing this MACC and all his team, and indeed Frank. And I suppose it's a comment from Frank and perhaps from Gary also, given the importance of reducing the finishing period from lower and striving to reduce it from 26 to 24 months. I think that them are the figures Gary put up. And the positive effect that slat mats have on this, and indeed Teagasc's latest trial back in 21 where they got a 13% increase in performance, which translates into a 19% reduction in carbon. Allied to that, a number of companies, including EasyFix, have a 31% reduction in ammonia on our product, which is a real hot topic now. It's not a greenhouse gas. So I suppose a comment from Frank, and also when would products like this be likely to wind their way on the MACC in terms of reducing greenhouse gases?
Okay. Frank, do you want to respond to that?
So I suppose the reduction in age at finish or age at slaughter is there's no single thing that's going to do that. We see it as starting with the genetics, get the right genetics, so you have animals that are bred for early finish or for good lifetime weight gain. Then it's the calf rearing, it's the calf health, it's the grassland management in both your first and your second grazing season. It's having good silage to feed them over the winter and maybe getting them out even before a second winter. That should be a target for a lot of our cattle. And anything that can improve performance, whether it's the housing or the lying conditions or whatever, that can contribute to that, that's very valuable. The individual things probably don't get into the MACC, unless there's what gets captured in the MACC in the EPA inventory is that animal was slaughtered at 20 months of age whereas in other years that would have been 24 months of age. So you're capturing the reduction in the age at which the animal was slaughtered. There's less animals around for different times of the year. So, you know, the fact that there was better animal health, or the fact there was better calf rearing or colostrum feeding or better silage made, the individual components that feed into that don't go in as individual measures into the MACC or into the inventory. And we're very focused here that whatever we do has to get captured in the inventory. There's no point asking farmers to do things and they don't see it showing up in the inventory. So whatever we do, we're focused on, well, can we get that in a way that the EPA can count it at some stage in the future in the inventory? So that's maybe a long-winded answer of saying that lots of things, including maybe maths or whatever, might contribute to better animal performance, but it's the outcome that gets captured in the inventory and in the MACC. And Gary, I don't know whether you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, I think that. Yeah, I think that pretty well sums it up. I would say that the chaps down Easy Fix do have a very nice facility that they have now to actually measure from replicated housing. So I'm looking very enviously at it. So I think in the future you guys will probably be able to give us the figures yourselves. Particularly in terms of ammonia abatement, but I would agree. So what we see in terms of animal health, there's a MACC within the MACC, and again there's a variety of measures that help improve that animal health piece and efficiency.
Okay, we're going to bring this panel to a close as we've run a little bit over time. Frank, would you like to sum up the morning? I mean, there's so much here. There's so much we could drill into further, let alone the second half of this morning with the adoption piece and farmer behaviour and incentives, and then the science alone in the first part of the morning. What's the next step, or how can you summarise it?
Well, look, I'm not going to try and summarise, but I would like maybe just to wrap up, and before, just a few wrap-up comments, just to thank, I suppose, the people that have, you know, enabled us to have an event like this today. And, you know, I've mentioned Gary and the team earlier that were involved in developing the MACC, and Tom and our advisory colleagues, and Tom representing those here today. But also, I'd like to thank all the co-panellists here and the area panellists for their contribution. And just to mention one or two colleagues, if you can bear with me, like Pat Dillon, my colleague over there, put a huge amount of work into the finalisation of the MACC and the preparation of the summary and so on, and also Stan Lawler there, and many other people. But just again, with the danger of singling out people always is you'll forget other people. But the man down there with the headphones on in the middle of the room with the beard, Declan McArdle, and his colleague over here, Rachel, behind the camera. You know, we make all these videos in-house, Suzanne, and you know the work that goes into production of that. So we wouldn't be able to do that without Declan and Rachel. And I don't know where Ciara is, down there very much at the back. Ciara is our stick, but our project manager on this event. And again, Ciara, we wouldn't have got here today without your managing, I suppose, of the process over the last month or so. And to thank the Minister for giving us his time to come here today, and yourself, Suzanne, for your expert chairing. So, look, that's the thank yous out of the way, but they're genuinely meant to all those people involved. So, look, I think we all know that, you know, this is a kind of an urgent problem among many urgent problems that we have. You know, we've water, we've biodiversity, we've welfare, we've lots of urgent challenges that are facing the industry. But this one, to me, it's going to be an enduring challenge. You know, climate change is not going to go away even in 2030 when we reach our targets, hopefully. So it's one that the industry, I suppose, I think has to grapple with. And at the same time, farming, you know, its primary purpose is to produce food and nutrition. And we have to do that, and we have to continue to do that, while at the same time we improve water quality and biodiversity and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in the end of the day, the really important thing for farmers is that they can continue to be profitable while they're doing that, and that we can retain the social licence to farm, and that we can have a farming system that attracts new entrants into. So there's a huge lot of challenges, I suppose, that are being directed at farmers. And it's no wonder, I suppose, at times, you know, like Mike McGann said, you know, they can feel confused because there's so many things, you know, this is important, that's important, you have to do this, you have to do that. So look, that's the challenge, I suppose, within all that we focus on one thing today, but we recognise that we have to tackle all these in an integrated way. And our job, we're not the ones that do the heavy lifting here. The farmers are the ones that eventually have to change practices or adjust their systems or diversify or whatever. And we're here to support you. And I suppose that's the message I'd like to say to farmers and the farm organisations that are here. That's what Teagasc is here to do, to support you either through our advisory and education service in the implementation of things and the adjustment of your systems, or through our research in trying to develop additional measures. And look, one thing, it is a very difficult pathway to 2030. The adoption levels that we require are very, very high. But when you look back at the MACC that we produced 5 years ago, there's a lot of additional measures in the MACC now. So science is not going to stand still and say, we've done our job, it's over to advisors, to help farmers implement these. The scientists will continue to work on developing new measures or refining the existing ones, making them more effective, so that we will have, hopefully, more tools in the toolbox by 2030, so that if we slip on one of those targets, maybe there's something else coming along that will take its place. So today, I suppose we've set out the pathway. There's a huge job to be done to deliver that pathway on the part of all the industry and farmers alike. Government, as I said, has a huge role to play, and they're well up for that, and got very competent people in the department on that. Industry, I think, well up for that. So look, there's a huge job, and I suppose we get a bit of lunch now, but I suppose the thing now is let's go and get to work, because every day counts in this. So it's a challenge, and we really have to put the shoulder to the wheel. So thanks very much to everyone for attending here this morning, and for your support of Teagasc and the role that we play in this, and we'll continue to do our best in this area and the other areas that are important to agriculture.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you everyone involved in this wonderful conference, and for everyone attending. Thank you.